thank you for starting this meeting. It's an important discussion, and thank you to the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics. It's a discussion around Eastern Europe that is very important, and I think we do it too little in Sweden. It's about our neighbors, and we often talk far too little around these questions that are important for us and our security and long-term also economic development. As a Minister for International Development Cooperation, I'm trying to make sure that Swedish aid contributes to hampering the negative effects of the pandemic that has been an essential task during this year. And democracy and human rights are being the main focus or area of Swedish development cooperation. I particularly noticed that the pandemic threatens to accelerate the global trends of democratic backsliding and weakening respect for human rights. The pandemic is intensifying existing inequalities, hitting those who are already marginalized, subjected to discrimination and living in poverty the hardest. Therefore, we need to make sure that human rights, democracy, and the rule of law and gender equality are at the center of both the immediate and long-term response. I would like to mention our priorities in our international cooperation with Eastern European countries. The fight against corruption is key. Also, when you talk about health and security questions. Corruption is a poison and obstacle for building trust and functional authorities and democracies. Independent media is also very central. In times of diminishing democratic space and increasing disinformation, a free and independent media is fundamental to build a democratic society. We must ensure transparency and access to reliable information, especially important when we know that Russia now is driving disinformation as a weapon to weaken countries and people's trust towards their own government and also towards West. A feminist foreign policy since 2014 has been established in our international development cooperation. It harmonizes well the strong role gender equality plays in Swedish reform cooperation with Eastern Europe. And we must also have a gender perspective in the response to COVID. The pandemic is linked to increased levels of, for example, sexual and gender-based violence in many countries, also in our. We need to remove structural discrimination and continue to promote women's economic and political empowerment and the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights. Poverty remains a major challenge for the countries in the region, especially on the countryside. Reform progress is necessary, but successful reforms have not always led to improved conditions for the most vulnerable and marginalized groups. Growth and development need to reach the broad population of our partner countries. And last but not least, the increasingly obvious consequences of climate change indicate the need for continued comprehensive environmental and climate promoting initiatives. Through environmental collaborations, we implement successful projects in energy efficiency and water purification that directly contribute to a better life for hundreds of thousands of people around Eastern Europe and a significant reduction in environmental hazardous emissions. To conclude, Eastern Europe continues to be a key focus for me. Sweden has long provided political and economic support to the countries in our eastern neighborhood, and this government has increased its commitment further. Sweden has allocated large sums to fight COVID, as has the European Union. At the same time, we must continue to also support sectors that are not immediately affected by COVID, as the pandemic has in many cases worsened the very problems we were already addressing with our development and reform support. The risk today is that Eastern Europe will get hit hard, but later than Western Europe, also in economic sense. To give you some background on our engagement in Eastern Europe specifically, for many years, Sweden has consistently supported the countries that re-emerged in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union in their efforts to develop and reconnect with Europe. We are involved in supporting central reforms, provide core support to important civil society organizations, and are a strong voice for democracy and human rights in the region as a whole. Our embassies are knowledgeable and are important dialogue partners in the countries. Since 2014, Sweden has a comprehensive regional strategy for cooperation with Eastern Europe. The strategy is focused on increased European Union integration, which is a key driver of change and an important tool for democratization, modernization, and fighting poverty. The strategy also focuses on strengthened democracy and human rights, as well as environmental and reduced climate impact. We are working together with civil society and supporting civil society and also public institutions. For the current strategy, Sweden allocated a total of approximately 400 million euro for Eastern Europe during the last 6 years. The government has also gradually increased the support in recent years. An important step was taken in June last year when we decided that a bilateral program for Armenia would be created to meet the positive democratic development in the country. 5 countries now have bilateral programs: Georgia, Armenia, Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Swedish support is coordinated with European Union support within the framework of the Eastern Partnership. I hope to be able to visit several partner countries as soon as the pandemic allows. Lastly, given the development this last month, I would like to say a word about Belarus. I admire the people that are fighting for the democratic change and human rights in the country. The Swedish government has a clear position regarding the elections that took place in August. It were neither fair nor open or transparent. Lukashenko did not win the election in a fair way. However, he is still responsible for the massive abuse that we have seen towards their own people. It's crucial that our reform support is sensitive to political developments in the countries we work with. Our decision to suspend several projects involving state actors in Belarus following the elections in August is a concrete example of that. Instead, we are intensifying our support to civil society. I met with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya the other week. Her strong message was that our decision to stop funds to state-owned projects has sent a clear signal to the people demonstrating on the streets as well as to the Belarus regime. We also pushed for a coordinated approach to Belarus within the European Union. It has been vital for Sweden that funds from the European Union does not support the Belarus state, but refocus towards civil society, as we have done within our own international cooperation. To conclude, Eastern Europe continues to be a key focus for me. Sweden has long provided political and economic support to the countries in our eastern neighborhood, and this government has increased its commitment further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Eriksson. I really appreciate it, and in particular, I appreciate your patience with our technical issues here as well. So I have prepared a couple of questions for you, so I hope that is okay. And I know that you probably covered parts of this in your presentation already, but maybe we can go a little bit more into detail in a few of these things. So we at the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics and our free network within Eastern Europe are, of course, very enthusiastic and happy about the fact that you are emphasizing Eastern Europe when it comes to Swedish, not only foreign policy, but also for Swedish policy when it comes to development cooperation. But that has perhaps historically not always been the case in Sweden, that the emphasis has been on Eastern Europe for the latter part. So I'm just wondering a little bit how you are thinking about the importance of that instrument in the sort of toolbox of foreign policy for Sweden when dealing with Eastern Europe and helping achieve the sort of foreign policy objectives that Sweden have for the region.
I believe that we have for a long time neglected Eastern Europe too much. It is central for Europe, and it's central for Sweden also, that we see the democratic and economic development in these countries. It's also a security question for us, both in Europe as a whole and Sweden. Of course, that we give the possibility that this window in time after the Soviet Union collapse, that it creates also a possibility for people, and people feel that we, the countries in West, see them and give them the possibility to get closer and also develop in a way that is possible. So I think that's important, and Sweden is central in this, because a lot of countries in the European Union are not focusing at all on Eastern Europe. They are focusing on Mediterranean, Africa, and other, and the Balkan countries and so on. And Sweden, I would say, Sweden and Poland has a central tasks to fulfill in this area. And international cooperation, especially when we now focus more on democracy, that is, then it's clear that Eastern Europe should be a central part in our political work.
Exactly, and following up a little bit there on your emphasis on democracy. I mean, your government is pushing this drive for democracy agenda, and I was just thinking a little bit about your thoughts on the links between the drive for democracy agenda and development cooperation policy, maybe in Eastern Europe, but also more generally. What are the tools available within the sort of international development cooperation portfolio that you think are useful for also promoting democracy where it's lacking, and maybe sort of reinforce it where it is a little bit shaky?
As I mentioned before, one key question is, of course, in open and independent media, free media and independent media. And we do that, for example, in many countries we have education for journalists, and we support small independent media and try to be a partner to deliver more pluralistic media scenes and situations, because often in many of these countries in Eastern Europe, media is very centralized, and a few actors are playing very important roles. So it's important also in security matters, because countries like Georgia, for example, and also Ukraine are often affected by the disinformation campaigns from Russia and others against the civil society and the citizens there. So that's one thing. Another important question is, of course, corruption. If we want to make to help these countries to build a stronger, resilient government and democracy, we have to build trust, and that's impossible if we have a high level of corruption. So I think corruption is also a key question if we want development, also in the economic scene. And also the judicial system overall is central if we want economic development, because European companies are very afraid to make big investments if they are not assured around the ownership questions and the judicial system.
Thank you. So maybe a little bit self-serving, but given that I am a researcher and from a sort of university, I'm also wondering a little bit about how you think about the role of higher education and research, both for economic development, of course, in the region, but also in terms of the drive for democracy. Do you see the university environment, do you see research as a pillar also for maybe sustaining and building on democracy?
Yeah, that's true. We have, for example, Raoul Wallenberg Institute that are promoting democracy and that kind of education around constitutions and so have been, for example, in Belarus during a few years, and are doing that in the universities. And I think that's also important to support independent and information around the universities that can come from another source and be more free from the old times and that hierarchy that we know.
So you mentioned corruption as well as being important, and that's of course always important when thinking about economic development and thinking about efficient development cooperation. Do you see particular challenges there in Eastern Europe, or do you, I mean, I know the case of Georgia, for instance, has for many been a very positive example of a country that managed to reduce the level of corruption at levels and that were perhaps surprising to many, given the high levels of corruption before.
Yeah, I think Georgia is also an example that it's possible to make a change and to get rid of the everyday corruption that you meet towards the police and teachers and the health system. It's probably even harder to get rid of corruptions in the political system higher up in the hierarchies. But I wouldn't say that the everyday corruption is probably extremely important if you want to get a higher degree of trust towards authorities.
So you mentioned Belarus as well, a country that we are all, of course, paying close attention to at the moment with a little bit of fear in our eyes, I think, all of us. Do you see any hope in terms of what Sweden can do to facilitate a sort of democratic transition? Do you feel any hope in terms of how the role EU can play and Sweden together with the EU in promoting this?
Well, it's certainly hopeful to see that people are fighting for democracy, human rights, and a change in Belarus. I think that's extremely important, but we also see a regime that doesn't exclude anything to preserve the existing situation, and that's also terrible to see the effects of that. But I would say in the long run, it will probably be very hard for the government and Lukashenko and others to preserve a situation when a big majority probably of the people wants to have a change. So I think we can be positive, but it will take time, and probably also the people will suffer more before it's over this.
So you mentioned that one thing that you do from Sweden's side and from the development cooperation side is that you have stopped all support going to state institutions. But are there also ways for you, are there inroads where you can also be more proactive in supporting what we can think of as change agents for?
We are supporting the civil society more than we did before. And we all have also, of course, a discussion between the European countries what we can do. And I know that Lithuania and Poland is also very active in this work. They have also direct borders towards Belarus and more of a people contact everyday life before when this happened at least. And especially Lithuania is very active, and we are supporting them also, and also people living abroad now.
Excellent. So let me weave in a question from the audience that I received here. So I'm just going to read this out. So I think that Swedish companies and industry can play a decisive role in the development work in the Central Eastern European region, in everything from setting better standards for equal rights, environmental protection, circular economy, fighting corruption. So why not open up for more cooperation with SIDA and similar organizations?
I think we are doing that, we're also pushing more for trade between our countries, not only from Sweden but also from the Eastern Europe countries to Sweden. So this is also a part of our bilateral strategies here now. Especially in Eastern Europe, I should say, we take in more of this development questions around trade. And I agree that Swedish companies could play a bigger role, but it's also what I said before, that sometimes investments, they are afraid to make big investments if they're not feel assured around the judicial system and also the corruption in some of these countries are still quite high, and they doesn't want to get involved with that, and it is very costly also.
Yeah, we will also see other major economic powers such as China more recently, but of course also Russia, investing in many of these countries. And
we saw also, for example, Telia that have made quite a big investments in the whole Eastern Europe, and also in the Asia part, countries like Kazakhstan and those countries, and they have finally had to leave because partly because the corruption.
yes, of course. And in thinking in those terms, having a development cooperation agenda focusing on strengthening institutions, moving towards democracy and decreasing corruption, of course, opens up more possibilities for investments from a country like Sweden, I think, where perhaps investors are a little bit more concerned about some of these issues that investors may be from some other countries where they may see a sort of corrupt government more as an opportunity of making an extra profit.
Yeah, the risk is that we are ending up with Swedish companies are getting more corrupt instead of the opposite.
Yeah, that's definitely what we want to try to avoid. So I think we are basically running out of time. So, and I, again, really sincerely apologize for the technical problems here. There has to be a first for everything, and this was the first time I have experienced it. So I think I need 2 showers tonight when I get home after this. But we do appreciate your patience, Minister Eriksson, and also from the audience.
Thank you so much. I feel that we see these technical problems sometimes, but most of the time it does work fairly well, I should say.
It does very well work most of the time. I completely agree. But I guess this is a bit of a reminder of that we all want to get back to normal life again. And hopefully with a more human touch, we can avoid at least some of these problems.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Eriksson. So we will now take a 5-minute break, the program, but we'll be back again at 10:50 for the next part of the program. So thank you very much, and I apologize again for the initial problems with the technicalities. Thank you. Hello again, and welcome back. So let's hope we have a session now that is a little bit more frictionless. So the next section of the program then is entitled The Economic Outlook for the Region. And in this section, we will take a broader look at the economic impact of the crisis, and on a more kind of macroeconomic perspective first, in the region. So with us for that, we have our first presenter, Alexander Plecano, who is the Director for Transition Impact and Global Economics at the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And then after that, after I let Alexander in, we will have a discussion focusing a little bit more on business climate with Frederick Jorgmark. But for now, Alex, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. I would like to give a brief update on the economic developments in the region indeed, but probably combining the macro and micro perspective and trying to make sense of both. Please do ask questions. I will be monitoring chat or questions at the end of the presentation. I've been on the receiving side of many Zoom presentations. It's much nicer. I think if there is some interactive element to it, it feels just a little bit more like real life to the extent possible. Let me try to do screen sharing and see how that works. Let's do that. Okay. I hope it works. Can people see the screen? Please do shout if it doesn't work.
Yes, it works. Thank you.
Excellent. So we looked at the COVID impact in the region using macroeconomic indicators, but we also, together with the IFO Institute in Munich, conducted a survey of the impact of COVID in 14 economies, out of which are 8 in the region where we operate and 6 are comparator advanced economies. And if you treat Greece as an advanced economy, we do operate in Greece, then there are 7 advanced economies and 7 emerging markets in this survey. And we did our best to make this survey representative by income decile, age, gender and education. Where it didn't work probably very well in terms of representativeness is the urban-rural divide, which was probably about 80-20 in this survey, 80% urban respondents, and that's the frontier of internet surveys at the moment, how to cover the rural population better. So what are the main takeaways from this survey compared with the main data? Well, one is that in the emerging markets, the impact of the crisis is very widespread. The breadth of it is much higher than the headline numbers would suggest, and much higher than in advanced economies. It is also quite clear that the impact over the first 5 months is comparable to the overall impact of the 2008 and 9 crisis, and that one was measured over 2 years. Here we're quite lucky to have our Life and Transition Survey, household survey that was conducted face-to-face in 2010, the second wave of that survey, covering 35 economies or so, where we had a special module on the impact of the 2010 crisis, and we replicated certain questions from that module in this. And we do find probably the same distribution of impact as other studies find, particularly harsh on those on lower income, lower education, younger people. We do find that the impact of the crisis is more unequal than the impact of the 2008 and 9 crisis. And this is just based on individual experiences and before taking into account the impact of the lower interest rate on asset holdings and wealth redistribution. There is a nice paper actually looking at that impact in continental Europe, mostly in France, showing that about 50% of the largesse in terms of crisis response accrued to the top 10%, and another 50% is probably to the next 40% or so, because if you didn't have assets before the start of the crisis, there is not very much to gain. And then there is always a debate whether the impact of the crisis can be more or less unequal in emerging markets than in advanced economies. And what we do find, probably in line with what has been published in various papers and IMF reports, is that the impact of the crisis is less unequal in emerging markets, just due to the nature of response, due to the feasibility of working from home and structure of the economies. But actually that difference is only 10% or so. So if you expect Gini to go up by, I don't know, 3 percentage points, in advanced economies, it would be 2.7 percentage points in emerging markets, something like that. And I think that delta between the two is quite a bit smaller than people expect, because ultimately the forces that underpin the crisis and the crisis response are actually remarkably similar in advanced economies and emerging markets. And most of it is based on work by colleague Zsoka Koshen, that got summarized in a working paper that I think is now out in our EBRD working paper series, and you can look it up. And now very briefly, if we look at the overall macroeconomic indicators, there is huge heterogeneity across economies. There is probably as much deviation in EBRD regions between these observations as in G7 economies and as in other emerging markets. I think reliability of these figures is frankly in this crisis is particularly low. People have all sorts of conspiracy theories why it may be the case related to propaganda and whatnot. But I think there are very acute methodological issues with that. How are these GDP indicators normally constructed? Well, normally a lot of it is based on surveys that statistics offices end up sending out to firms. Firms respond to these surveys and these responses are aggregated. Now in lockdowns, what happens is that a lot of time you send this to nowhere and firms do not respond. And we know it firsthand because together with the World Bank, we also tried to follow on the enterprise survey. So what do you make of it? Well, you could, of course, conclude that a firm that doesn't respond is closed for business. And so value added of it is zero. And it would have probably worked 20 years ago, but now it doesn't really work because it turns out that even in Britain, the response rate to surveys sent out by the Office of the National Statistics, the Statistics Office, is about 42-43% these days. A couple of decades ago, it was 90%. There is a huge survey fatigue out there. I don't know whether you respond to all the surveys that you get. And so it becomes tremendously difficult for statistical officers to actually process this information. If we look back at what happened in 2008-9 crisis, when the estimates were actually easier to obtain, you would find that the flash estimate in February 2009, say for the fourth quarter of the year, was kind of all over the place in emerging markets in particular, relative to final estimate. There was a little bit more correspondence between the first and final estimate in advanced economies, but it was still very much all over the place. I think it's nice to have the mobility curves. This hasn't been updated, but it's sloping down further. The problem with mobility curves that people use widely is the fact that they linked to February levels. It is sometimes difficult, in particular for tourism oriented economies, for economies with high seasonality, to actually sort of have an informed view of what it means that August levels have more or less recovered to where they were in January, February. But otherwise, it is a useful tool. And what's interesting to highlight here is that even in economies with few legal restrictions, and I think people here in Sweden would very much identify with that, there is a lot of voluntary social distancing out there. And this voluntary social distancing is to a large extent determines economic outcomes as much as the regulations, or sometimes more than regulations. So Belarus adopted a fairly laid-back approach, unlike most other economies in the region, and still you see a considerable amount of decline in trips to recreation, to workplaces, to transit stations, and so on. Here, I think that it basically is a similar picture in Russia, in Ukraine. So I think that what I would like to emphasize here is that indeed you have this voluntary aspect that is very important. And there is a big differentiation in the economy by now between the manufacturing, the goods side of things, and the services, which is very much evident in our economies as well. The manufacturing sector has had a supply shock. It still has a supply shock in some cases, but there is actually a positive demand shock, because in a modern economy, 40% of consumption is in services, and suddenly people, but in services relying on social distancing, there is actually little variation between the countries on that, and people were told that they cannot consume. Some of it gets relocated to, people just spend more on home improvements and whatever goods they can put their hands on. It's not very much. I think the demand for goods is up by maybe 4 or 5 percentage points overall. But for the manufacturing sector, it is a net gain. A lot of this net gain actually has accrued flatly to China, where the retail sales are down like everywhere else, but industrial production is not at all. And the services. In services, there is a supply shock, probably, but there is also a huge demand shock everywhere. The fact that people have not really gone to the beach this summer was largely a demand shock, to a much lower extent, the supply shock. And that remains. And that dichotomy shapes the fortunes a little bit. A lot of economies in our region rely on tourism, and for them, a major demand shock remains. It is definitely the case that in most of these economies, domestic tourism is just not capable of replacing the international tourism, just because the magnitude of the two is very different. You have basically outbound tourists overnight stays as percent of inbound tourists, and there are actually countries like Sweden on this chart, or Luxembourg, where the outbound tourism is a factor of 3 to inbound tourism in these places, and actually Britain is a place like that with a factor of 2. In these cases, you can expect some substitution in tourism, which people have seen, but in a lot of places, where we work in Croatia or in Greece or in Morocco, this ratio is actually 1 to 5, so 20%. Is the outbound tourism travel relative to inbound tourism travel. So relying on substitution does not actually bring you very much. The other thing, and this is also actually true everywhere apart from Denmark, and I'm very curious actually to hear if you have views about why Denmark is different, but there is this official data on how much foreign tourists spend relative to domestic tourists, and it's a huge multiple, because it's very unlikely for the Dutch to go and spend 300 euros a day on an apartment overlooking Amsterdam Canal, that kind of thing. And so it's generally true for pretty much every economy. The domestic tourism spend is about 1/3 of international tourism spend. So I think that that sector, if the demand shock doesn't go away, is still in for a very hard time. Now, what do we find in this survey? We find that about 15% of respondents in the PPRD region lost their job, and 15% had to close a family business during this pandemic, during the COVID-19 crisis. And this is quite a bit higher than in advanced economies, and also a bit higher or comparable to the 2008 and 9 crisis. But this is not to say that actually there are that many unemployed people. You will not see 15% unemployment in Poland. And I think that underscores, firstly, the dynamism of these markets. If you have much less labor protection, you actually have a more agile labor market response. And we see these differences in the way people increase their hours in the same job or took on an extra job. These responses in emerging markets, a factor of magnitude different from the advanced economies, where most people had job protection, some form of furlough schemes. We So this underscores the dynamic response. The other thing is that the way traditionally unemployment is measured in these surveys, I think we have to remind ourselves how it is done. The question is, have you had any income from a paid activity in the last 7 days? So if somebody went to do a very part-time job of Uber driving or delivery or the like, they are not in this unemployment statistic. And certainly I witnessed it firsthand this summer in Italy, where you would go to a nice village restaurant, the only one that is open full, and you have a different crew serving you every night. And then you ask them and they say that, yes, they all work doing this waitressing once or twice a week, because that's the only job there is in the village this summer. And so in this sort of communal sense, it's shared widely. And so none of these people will be unemployed, but effectively all of them lost the job, whatever job there was for them beforehand. So this is how one needs to reconcile a little bit the micro and macro evidence. And in general, if we just look at it in a systematic way, the correlation between official statistics, unemployment and unemployment data from the survey, they do match closely. You can also see the transition between unemployed, furloughed, official leave, etc. And certainly there is quite a bit of differentiation here across economies. And I think the more informal economies are Ukraine, Egypt, etc., and even Greece, because in Greece actually 30% of people are self-employed, the more they go from employment to unemployment without any intermediate steps. So there was some variation here, and I think one thing that is interesting to highlight here is that individuals were mostly affected in economies like Turkey and Egypt that are doing best when you look at their national statistics of growth and growth alone. Turkey reported 6.7 year-on-year growth in the third quarter of this year, something that even China has not succeeded in reporting. And so there is indeed also a lot of differences here between survey evidence and the macro evidence. Some of them are reconcilable and some of them are much harder to reconcile. Many households had to reduce their spending and consumption due to COVID. I will not dwell too much of it, but we do see it, and we do see quite a bit of variation here, and certainly that feeds more into the demand shock, in particular in the services industry further, because ultimately the kind of travel, recreation and meals out, etc., it's much more of a discretionary element to it than to food consumption, goods consumption, etc. And if we look at the incidence, we do find in the BRD region, as in advanced economies, that the incidence of crisis and job losses is strongly concentrated among people with less education and less income. And we do some simulations involving Gini coefficients, which I mentioned, and they actually highlight the fact that the differences are not overwhelming between emerging markets and advanced economies. And you can see from this chart that actually the shape of this chart is quite a bit similar. The young have been hardest hit. This is a bit different, and in advanced economies, this is much sort of, let's say the other way around. In emerging markets, it's much more concentrated on the youngest group here, of those below 25. In advanced economies, they are a bit more protected, I think in part because it's a smaller group. It's a group that is to a much greater extent in education, and it's also a group that was able to draw on the government support schemes because they're generally income truncated, and much higher portion of income would be covered on average for this group. Those working for smaller firms in the private sector and on non-permanent contracts have been hit harder, at least in the short term. So all this is fairly intuitive, and I think this is comes strongly from the regression analysis. Job losses were less likely in the public sector, but only for the more educated stuff. So that is actually an interesting fact in itself, that the sort of caricature or the stylized fact that state employment acts a little bit like as an automatic stabilizer is actually true. We wrote about it in this year's transition report, which is on state versus private, but it's also important to highlight that it actually once again concerns the more educated segments. And if we sort of we could say that cleaners are as likely to lose their job in a state firm as they are in a private firm. And you would also see what you expect, that where share of jobs that can be done from home is higher, the job losses due to COVID-19 crisis were lower. We would also see slightly different profile of job losses by income decile. Here we have the emerging markets concentrated in really the top bracket. And in advanced economies, the dividing line is probably the top 40% versus the bottom 60%. And I think it's related to the actual incidence of jobs that can be done from home. My mom back in St. Petersburg has a job that can be perfectly done from home theoretically, but in practice, the software that coincidentally was developed in Belarus makes it, I think, quite difficult to do it in practice the same way as I would do it here in London. So in theory, when we look at occupations and the type of jobs that can be done from home, this may be much more similar than in reality. And I think this is something that the survey also tells us. And we do find that in Logit models that the impact of the survey is more unequal than in the 2008 and 9 crisis. We have to do it by education, by residents, urban, rural, by public sector employment, because in that survey by assets, we actually didn't have information on income in 2010 survey. And certainly what we see in emerging markets is that the fiscal response, for all these differences, fiscal response has been large. The packages averaged 4.2% of GDP. And we do see the same relationship that the more fiscal stimulus you had, mostly in terms of job protection, the less job losses you had in the short term in the economy. That holds, although the statistical relationship here is probably not as strong as you could otherwise expect. Public debt is expected to increase significantly by about 11 percentage points by the end of 2020. But here it's important to emphasize that only around 1/3 of it is actually fiscal stimulus. Most of it is either exchange rate fluctuations or, to a greater extent, collapse in GDP levels. And this is what driving the ratio up. We also conducted an SME survey in Central Asia and North Africa, and we see what you would expect to see, that there are a lot of more firms in hospitality, recreation, and services that were very badly affected. And firms have actually back then in the summer, they had very low expectations of things returning to normal in the next 6-12 months. And in particular, actually exporters expected less normalization than non-exporters. I think that what also is interesting, that a lot of SMEs tried to move at least some of their sales online during the pandemic in all sorts of markets. We see that. We don't know here, it's just a binary question. We don't know how many sales and how successful they were. We have certainly, we can see that a significant share of populations have started shopping online. And I think in some economies that has been a large shift, and in some economies it has been a small shift to online. In Russia, for example, it has been a massive shift, I think, from about 7% to 11% of the market. And this is actually even more impressive because, at the start of it, according to the Findex database of the World Bank, actually 40% of this online shopping was still paid in cash on delivery, and relatively little of it was paid online in a normal economy. Well, not in a normal, in an advanced economy where we would think of normal online shopping, like here in Estonia or Latvia, most of it is paid online as well as delivered online. And this is definitely something that this payments on delivery is something that is very prevalent, in particularly in the Western Balkans, but also even in places like Bulgaria and Romania. And maybe it is something that this pandemic will be able to overcome or not. I think that that remains to be seen. I will stop here, and I will stop sharing the screen, and we'll have a quick look at the chat questions, if there have been any. No, not really. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alex, very much, with a lot of interesting details about what's going on in the region as such. So as I said before, we really encourage you to send us questions about Alex's presentation as well, but we will come to those after we have had a discussion with our next speaker. So our second guest then is Frederick Jorgmark. So Frederick is CEO of Medicover, a specialized provider of diagnostic and healthcare services with main markets in Eastern Europe, for instance, in countries such as Poland, Ukraine, and Romania. Frederick has worked in the company since its start more than 25 years ago, so he has a long and extensive experience with regards to the business environment in the region. So welcome, Frederick.
Thank you.
We are delighted that you could be here and that you can participate. We really appreciate to get a take also from sort of the business side of things as well for the region. So may I first ask you a little bit about, about Medicover. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about Medicover and your engagement in Eastern Europe?
Sure. So we are a healthcare services business. So we provide services, no products, and no manufacturing. So we are quite a large organization nowadays. So we have about 32,000 people employed or contracted across the countries where we operate, which I think makes us in most countries the largest or second, third largest Swedish employer. We've been around for 25 years, as you said. So we got going in Poland. And Poland is still our largest geographic presence, and followed by Ukraine and Romania, significant businesses, and also down in the Balkans with Serbia. And over the past sort of like 4 or 5 years, we've also developed quite a starting presence in India. So that's sort of our footprint. We do two things. We have about half of what we do is a pure services business where we run hospitals and clinics and a number of specialty services where we primarily sell that into the private system where employers would pay for their staff or private individuals pay directly to us. But we also do, not insignificant amount of government work in Poland, running hospitals, etc. And that is also in Romania and other parts of Eastern Europe. And the other half of our business is an in vitro diagnostics business, so blood and tissue diagnostics, where the largest markets would be Romania, Ukraine, and Poland, and also in the eastern part of Germany. So that's sort of what we do.
Excellent. That's very impressive. So with this long experience working in the region, can you perhaps tell us a little bit about how you perceive the business environment and how it has changed over time, generally?
Yeah, it clearly has changed a great deal. So perhaps the largest milestone, I think, in terms of change was clearly when Poland, our core economies, entered into the EU. You can say it's been a gradual shift ever since we started, but I think that by a long shot is the biggest impact in terms of change. So, I've been traveling obviously before I went to Medicover, I did something else for 5 years in the region. So I've seen this since the change of the system. So I think it's been a rather dramatic change, not the least. Poland is where I spend most of my time and clearly that's a big difference. And I think you see change on a gliding scale, as when you travel to Kiev nowadays. Perhaps that is like Warsaw, sort of 10 or 15 years ago, and 10 years in the future it will. I mean, they're all on a trajectory of change. So it's just a big change. I think the most fundamental part of a question I quite often get is, you've sort of been doing this for 25 years, and don't you get tired of it? And I think the most stimulating and fascinating thing for me in terms of this change is that I think the entire region has a, when I say everyone, of course it's not everyone, but most people you come across has a, sort of a very strong belief in the future. We all do something because tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday. And I think that's actually quite a bit of a difference sometimes between the, if you wish, the emerging eastern part of Europe versus the western part. I think that's really both encouraging and positive, I think.
I'm very, very happy to hear that. And I think thinking about the current situation in Belarus is a sort of case in point for that the population there believe that there is a brighter future for them and that they can reach it for sure. So I know, and Minister Eriksson was also pointing and alluding to this a little bit, that one of the key challenges perhaps for Swedish investors working in the region has to do with concerns about corruption. And how do you perceive that? Obviously, there's variation across different markets, but how has it changed over time?
I mean, historically, I think that's been the biggest problem, and that has certainly not gone away. But it is dramatically much better. So not the least the EU introduction I mentioned, and the involvement of various international institutions in terms of providing funding, and in exchange for that making sure that some of these historic practices are gone. So again, I think you see that on a scale where 20 years ago it was a big issue in Poland. I don't think it is today. I don't think, in fact, it's an issue at all, at least not what we notice. Now, one of the reasons, what I didn't say, we have probably about sort of 85% of our revenue is private pay, and only perhaps 15-18% is public money. And in my industry, in our industry, where you unfortunately see corruption is typically where you do public tenders, because of course that's where money is around. And in public tender situations, obviously, people can influence where contracts go, and that sort of leads to that, unfortunate. So, we have largely stayed away from that, really, to avoid having to be confronted. I mean, as a company, and we're also a public company, so of course, we must have sort of zero. We can't even come close to a situation that would sort of spell corruption. So we basically just stayed away from it. But clearly, that has slowed down development in many of the countries. But I'm optimistic. I mean, you can take Romania as a case in time, when they put in this anti-corruption agency that many politicians have tried to do away with, but with a strong precedent and a lot of public will from the people to stand up for it. It's there, and I think Romania has had one of the toughest, harshest crackdown on public corruption I think you've seen anywhere, and I think that has largely worked. So while it has been a super big problem, I think it's being dealt with, although it certainly has not gone away completely.
So the membership in the European Union, of course, has been important for instigate some of these important institutional reforms that have helped countries deal with levels of corruption and so on. Some argue that once you're a member, we don't have the same lever in terms of keeping that work up. I mean, there's a discussion right now in Europe that is more on the political side, perhaps with regards to Poland and Hungary. But do you sense that also with regards to investments or the business climate, in a sense, in a country like Poland, that this is affecting your sense of rights of property rights or anything like that?
I don't think it has gotten that bad, but I share the concern that I think to me the EU as you wish a political project, perhaps ahead of an economic project, I think has been incredibly successful for the countries in Eastern Europe, and perhaps today sometimes some people sort of fail to recognize that and want to keep the goodies out of the bag, but not the rest, so to speak. So I think that criticism to me is valid, and time will tell how that politically plays out. But I think what we see today in some places is unfortunate, we don't want to get too political. So we'll see how the next the election comes out. But I think clearly, the amount of funding and financial support that has gone into the countries where we operate from the European Union, I think that needs to be recognized locally.
Thank you. So maybe turning a little bit the attention to the current situation then. So in the markets where you operate, how do you see the COVID crisis impact on your business and the ability of individuals to, as you say, sort of, since you have many private customers?
Sure. When listening to Alexander's presentation there and showing the graphs, I think that's very representative of what we see. I mean, we then, as I said before, we really have two large customer groups. We have companies that are employing people in their own industries, and to be able to be attractive employers, they need a good healthcare cover, and that's where we come into the picture. So we're quite cyclical in that respect. So when employers are really demanding to find new people, we tend to have really good times, and if the opposite is true, it's the other way around. And the other customer groups are then private people spending money on their own healthcare, be it dentistry or whatever it happens to be. And so what we saw, we, like pretty much anyone else, we had a very sort of cliff-like fall off in late March, April with the lockdowns, where effectively people weren't allowed to come unless you had acute symptoms, but basically all elective treatments disappeared for about sort of 6 weeks. And then we had a very strong rebound where you both had, when the economies or society started to open up again, you had both the underlying demand and then I think a very sort of a big rebound of replaced demand from the lockdown. So when we sort of read that as an evidence that we provide a lot of sort of society essential services. So I think that that's one thing. Secondly, in terms of businesses, I think what we see and that was shown on the graphs we saw, it's a very similar, the industries that have been hardest hit in our countries are the same as in Western Europe. Now, we are not that exposed to the leisure and sort of those kind of industries. So we relatively we have been perhaps less hit from our revenue side in that respect. And perhaps another thing to say is that given Poland and being our largest market, and I'm not sure if there may be any other economists on this call that have a different opinion, but my view in terms of Poland specifically is that prior to this crisis, I think one of the largest challenges to the Polish continued economic growth was the fact that they had almost virtual no unemployment. So you could hardly find qualified labor because of the high temperature in the economy. So now obviously a lot of people were laid off, and we saw 5-6% GDP drop as was noted on these prior graphs. But I think the reabsorption of labor is probably going faster in Poland because people being laid off in some of these hardest hit sectors, they are relatively more quicker, I think, than in many other countries, being re-employed in other sectors of the economy that previously were looking long and hard to find these employees. So relatively, certainly, significantly impacted, but I think perhaps relatively more quicker bouncing back than in many other places.
Excellent. So maybe following up a little bit on that in terms of the sector you are working in and the critical role it plays with dealing with sort of the health aspects of this crisis. So if we turn the tables a little bit, I mean, how do you see Medicover and you as a company, how can you help alleviate the crisis in the region in a sense and contribute to this notion of build back better?
I mean, I would put that in sort of three camps. If you take our sort of ambulatory services or the non-hospital setting services, it used to be in Poland, Romania, and the other countries until about a month ago that the state did not allow the private sector to treat inpatient COVID cases. That was only state care that did that. Now, since about a month back, that has been opened up to also have the private sector coming in to allow more beds in that setting. So both in Poland and Romania, since about a month back, we also treat a fair number of COVID cases in our hospitals. But the vast majority of what we do on that side has, of course, been the ambulatory diagnosis, because anyone that sort of fears or suspects they may have the virus, many of those have come to our ambulatory clinics and being diagnosed, suspected, and then tested. If confirmed, and being sent off to the state hospitals. So in terms of actually that field work to try and minimize the ongoing spread in society by as early as possible identifying those who have the virus, I think that has been and still remains a very big ongoing effort from our side. And secondly, on the diagnostic side, that may be more obvious, and perhaps stating the obvious, that of course we run these various methodologies where the PCR testing is recognized as the most reliable one. And the entire industry, and certainly the entire industry in Central and Eastern Europe, had tremendous challenges in the spring and summer to scale up capacity to be able to meet the skyrocketing demand for PCR testing. So in many countries, we're actually a major, and it's in Romania, for example, to my knowledge, we are the single largest provider of PCR testing for COVID to the public system. We do a lot of work in Ukraine, we do a lot of work in Poland. So across the region, we contribute significantly to that sort of testing effort, which is probably the only way that you really can get the virus spread under control.
Yes, you're clearly in a very vital part of the sort of health sector in that respect. So may I also ask you, I mean, we're all hoping for a vaccine, of course, and a rollout in many countries, Sweden included, but also in Eastern Europe, of government-run programs, I guess, to be able to mass vaccinate. Are you part of that discussion in your countries as well? Are you going to play a part in anything like that, as you know, for now?
Not for now. We have announced our good intentions, so to speak. We have not yet been asked that question yet. So if we will, we will certainly do our part, but that discussion has not yet started.
Do you see a preparedness in these countries? I mean, there's debates, of course, big debates in Sweden about how we have handled the situation and how prepared we are for mass vaccination. How do you sense the situation look like in the region you are working? Are governments organized? Are they starting to prepare for this? Do they have access to vaccines?
Well, I think the preparedness is probably not great, but it's not very bad either. So I think it's on that sort of middle scale. And then it's a little bit, I'm not going to single out any countries publicly like this, but I think some are pretty good, well prepared, and some almost not at all. So I think it's a very sort of varied picture if you look across the region. And then one of the good things with the EU, again, if you have this where the EU source vaccine, the Commission has clearly stated that that will be allocated across member countries, not based on income levels, but based on population levels. So I think whereas in the early days, perhaps one was a bit worried that the rich countries would take all the vaccine to start with, but my understanding is that it's going to be allocated across member countries fairly, which I hope will happen. So and you saw today, this morning, the announcement that Pfizer got approval to start to distribute in the UK. So they will vaccinate in the UK within 2 weeks. So let's hope for the best. This rolls out quickly now.
Yes, I think we are all across the world very much hoping for the best with respect to the vaccine rollouts.
Yeah.
So I know that you have at Medicover worked with sort of digital technology to connect healthcare providers with patients. And how is that market? Definitely there's been a big development here in Sweden recently. And how is that market developing in Eastern Europe, you see, in the markets you are operating? And what role do you think this can play for the future in these markets?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because what has happened in many sort of parts of the economy historically in this part of the world is that well, if you take the banking system, there was, but when the banks came in to revitalize the East European banking system, that's traditional problem with legacy system that you can't throw out the old system, so you have to live with them and patchwork into a modern world. You know, that was all they sort of just put in the new system because the old they were so poor or bad. So you sort of leapfrog perhaps 3 generations of technology, and to some extent that is happening in healthcare as well. I'm not making that as a general statement across everywhere, but I think the level of digitalization, certainly in the private part of the healthcare system in Eastern Europe, is well, I'm not saying it's higher than Western Europe because I have no measurement to actually state that. But when I look at ourselves and our key competitors, how they work, it's a very actually digitalized world. You can take this the onset of the pandemic in March, April, where if you take then, we have this insurance model that I talked about where employer pays, so where we sell our insurance policies to employers, and then we provide care under all of these policies through our own clinics and hospitals. And we have about 1.4 million people insured in those programs, where again, Poland would be larger. But of course, when this sort of lockdown happened and people weren't allowed to go out, how do you service this? And it's not that people have less health concerns in a pandemic. Probably, if anything, it's the other way around. So you have even more reason to come and visit the doctor. And we were able to shift the vast majority of our service provision from a physical world onto our digital platforms pretty much from a week to another. So I think we almost scaled up our digital provision with a factor of 10, well, sort of 8 perhaps. But most of our doctors and medical staff have worked remotely via digital platforms, which I think is fantastic, really. And our customers are super happy about it. So I'm not saying this just to promote Medicover that we're so good. So it's more, I think it's an industry feature that digitalization has come quite, as you know, Eastern Europe historically, before the change in the systems, had I think a very sort of high level of, particularly down in Bulgaria and Romania, where a large part of the sort of technology development in the previous system happened. So you really have a strong base of capabilities to develop this. So we have all along developed our own bespoke systems with development hubs in Romania, but now we've also moved part of it to Ukraine since a number of years back. So I think it's actually really, it works really well.
Well, that's fascinating to hear. So you would say that the digital infrastructure is good enough to be able to scale this up substantially in terms of reach of the population. I mean, I guess one concern sometimes with these kind of instruments is that it's only going to reach a certain segment of the population, and maybe those who are a little bit better off and more educated and so on. Do you think there's reason to be a bit concerned about this increasing the inequality of healthcare services in these regions or countries?
Well, I mean, my view is actually my view is a little bit the opposite, because I think and I sit here in Stockholm, for example, where I know that debate is quite often argued that sort of the private system crowds out the public system, and no one should be allowed to jump a queue or inequality, etc. I think if we look at the situation in our countries, it's a fact that overall healthcare funding is always insufficient. However much you raise taxes or however much you do, there is just not going to be enough of money to provide the level of care that people expect and need. And historically, the private contributions came different ways, but nowadays it's taxed money, it's public insurance premiums. So if you take Poland, it's probably about a third of overall funding is private, and 2/3 is public. And of course, the 1/3 which is private basically means, that's money into the pot to provide care. So I think it's an incredibly important contribution. Plus, of course, that segment of the population that pays in the private contribution, whether that happens to be via their employer or directly, they will not go and use public system resources. So that will then be able to be used for all those people that either can't afford it, or retired or unemployed, etc. So while clearly in the best of worlds, I wished everyone had access to the same level of healthcare, but practically anywhere in the world, that's just not going to happen. So what is the second best? And I think the second best is to try and make sure you bring as much money as possible into the overall healthcare funding to provide the best possible service to everyone. Then, of course, innovation I think that may perhaps a bit controversial when I say that, but I think innovation tends to be faster in the private system. So I think private system adopts, digitalization faster than perhaps some state players. But that is not to say that they don't follow. So I think in this respect, the private system has an important role to play to sort of, break the ground. And then and I'm talking healthcare now. So, and then in our part of the world where I've seen that happen many times, where then, private sector solution ideas have then been put into public healthcare later on. So I think it's not a one-sided picture, but I think overall it's a very positive development.
So more complements than substitutes, and there's still room for synergies in terms of learning and so on. That's very good news. So maybe a last question from me in this kind of back and forth, and then we can let in Alex as well and open up for questions from the floor. But from your long history of being an entrepreneur and businessman in this region, and from the perspective of other Swedish investors and businessmen who are contemplating maybe I should invest in the region. How should I think about it? Maybe I'm concerned about what I hear about corruption and instability. So what would be your final positive words? Why would you make the leap?
Well, I would say two things. I would repeat what I said early in this conversation. I think this region has a fantastic pool of professional and hardworking people that strives for a better tomorrow. And the second thing is that in most businesses across the world, it's very hard to find growth nowadays. There's hardly any growth anywhere. And this part of the world, perhaps not in every sector, but certainly in healthcare and many of the other service sectors, you have strong underlying growth alongside ongoing GDP growth and upgrading of the systems, etc. So fantastic people, and I think long-term sustainable growth. Those would be the two most important things, to have other people come and join us in this part of the world.
I'm very happy to hear that, and fantastic people. That is something that I can certainly assign to from my experience in the region as well. So can we let in Alex now as well to make sure that we're all here? Yep, there's Alex. Excellent. So let me start with a couple of questions, or I'll take them one by one. So I have a question to Alex here. So I'm going to just read it out loud here. So the autumn wave of the pandemic has been much more dramatic compared to the spring wave in the Central and Eastern European region. Many countries in the region could respond with large policy packages in the spring. What is, in your view, their ability to react with adequate support for the economies in response to the autumn developments and restrictions?
It's an excellent question. Thank you. Before I answer that, maybe I'll abuse my privilege as a speaker and just say that it's very much interesting how our impression about how the region is different, the previous question, based on a lot of analytical work and just number crunching. It's very similar to what Frederick has just said based on his experience. But if you look at how this region is different from other emerging markets, there are more or less two things. Well, two positive things is skills. I think that the level of skills is more or less in line with what you find in advanced economies, and very different from what you find on average in other emerging markets. I think it remains a great asset, and if anything, technological development makes the premium associated with these skills ever greater. And it is, of course, also a problem for the healthcare, because at the heart of healthcare is very skilled labor, and it is becoming ever more expensive relative to other labor. Actually, I'm very curious to hear from Frederick, if there is time left, how one can control costs in healthcare provision. I think a big question for all of us. And integration. If you look at these economies and you compare apples with oranges, you just do this exercise, you divide average foreign direct investment received over the years by average gross capital formation, so investment in fixed assets. These ratios are on average much higher than anything you see in other parts of the world. That has been the model for the last 20-25 years. Now here you may have your views whether now the model is vulnerable to disruption or not, but it has always been the model built around integration, built around the likes of Swedish companies coming and actually making use of this highly skilled labor, because maybe locally the ability to organize this labor, management skills, governance, etc., maybe actually innovation may be lacking. That leads me to the question, how should economies respond to the second wave? I think there is the distinction to be made between ability to respond and need to respond. Let me start with the ability to respond. Ability to respond is a combination of two things: fiscal space, can you just raise the money, and administrative capacity to deliver to those who need this support most. I think on the first, on fiscal space, a lot of economies have a lot of that fiscal space. Today, Poland borrows in zloty 10-year money, the government, at roughly the same rate as US does borrow 10-year in US treasuries. Of course, it's a reflection of quantitative easing that emerging markets have adopted, many things, but we have seen complete compression of rates anywhere between AAA and BBB+. Poland is A- on the rating scale. So a lot more economies have that fiscal space. Not all. Lebanon has zero, but it's by and large. And then there is administrative capacity. I think it's really remarkable that Britain here in 7 weeks managed to build a system of compensating workers from scratch and deliver. And they reckon there was 4 billion of fraud or something like that, but it's actually very little on the scale of this. Now, not all economies have been able to actually build these very targeted support schemes. And I think as the earlier analysis that I presented shows, it has to be targeted. The impact of this is very uneven. So I think the more you are able to do it targeted, the more there is a case for it. And then there are people like Olivier Blanchard that will tell you that it is completely inconceivable that a new normal will emerge. People will always want the kind of services that they consumed. It's inconceivable that demand for travel will go down. It's inconceivable that demand for eating out will go down in the long term. And so the name of the game is just to protect those jobs if you can support them. And that's kind of Blanchard view. And this if relies on fiscal capacity and administrative capacity. And that's fine. I think one can take this view. But one can also take the view that the world may be changing. And maybe we don't want to zombify and solidify these economies, maybe undergoing the pain today in a hope to convert, and gain new markets and establish oneself in new sectors and technologies. Maybe this is the adjustment that needs to happen. Maybe shopping moves online. If it moves now by 4 percentage points up in Russia from 7 to 11 percentage points, well, this is 4 percentage points taken off the high street. You can take a view on whether these high street jobs need to be protected or the shopping even in new normal will be more online. I think if you take the latter view, it may well be counterproductive to use taxpayer money to save these jobs. Maybe one needs to provide assistance to these people, but not necessarily in the form of paying them for the job that they're currently doing. And I think this is the choice that every economy has to make, every government has to make. These are hard choices, and I think inside governments, there are increasingly very different views. It was astonishing to see yesterday that UK Parliament had a minority vote on extending basically a version of national lockdown in the UK. In the UK Parliament, there are 650 people and 296 voted for it. The majority is 3-6. So the majority of all MPs and 70 something against, everyone abstained. You have a parliament where suddenly no one has a view. on what the country should do in this COVID situation. And this is United Kingdom that generally prides itself on a long history of governance that has been exported to many other economies of the world. So it just tells you how difficult the decision making is inside the governments, and I think it is important to reach that consensus view and implement it on this. And that actually brings me to the question from Jonathan Lane about should be worried about the buildup of debt if one assumes the debt route. And I think one can be worried indeed, but one should be worried both ways. I think that one should be worried if it's a problem, and one should be worried in particular if it's not a problem. Because, why is cost of debt zero today for anyone between AAA and BBB? There is, of course, some magic of, financial engineering, but ultimately long-term interest rates is an equilibrium between investment and savings. It's demand for investment and the supply of savings. And suddenly today, there is very little demand for investment. And there is a lot of supply of savings. Because if people, a lot of people sit at home, like I do, talk on Zoom, I still get paid my old salary and maybe my savings go up. At the same time, the government saves, of course, it borrows a lot, but the balance of it is not clear. And in many countries, it's positive. So you have this zero interest rate. Now, in principle, this zero interest rate can be sustained for a very long time. In Japan, it has been 30 years. Of that. In human history, if you think about it, the first massive quantitative easing / zero interest rate was Islam, when people were told that interest rate should be zero, full stop. Positive interest rate is prohibited. And so yes, I will cut at that. But basically all I want to say is that the long-term equilibrium in which debt is fully sustained without a problem because everyone pays a zero interest rate is only consistent with zero investment and zero growth. And whether, if there is no debt crisis and debt problem, if it's a desirable scenario is hard to tell. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alex. So, I mean, the time is running out, but maybe we should end on a positive note and encourage everybody to go out and actually invest in productive activities and not just hoard the money in assets and in bank accounts. But I really want to thank Alex and Frederick for very insightful comments and points. And to the audience, remember, we have a lunch break now, but we reconvene again after lunch. And I hope to see you then. And again, sorry for the mishaps in the morning, but now everything seems to be in order. Thank you very much.
This great year started. The prospects for Belarusian economy were not so great. Even the best forecasts projected only 1% growth, and we started the year with a huge crisis in relations with Russia, and Russia stopped the oil supplies, which plays a huge role in the Belarusian economy. So even in the first quarter, we already had a GDP contraction. And when we heard about COVID and when we realized what it means for a small open economy like Belarus, we understood that that was kind of a perfect storm coming to hit our economy. And my colleague, Dmitry Kruk, who was, by the way, detained this Sunday during protest and is now in jail for 15 days. So in March, he sat down and made some projections. And he saw that even in the best case scenario, our economy is going to contract at least by 4% this year, and the major contraction would happen in the second quarter, and it would be like 10% contraction in the quarterly terms. So what happened next is that the government decided to ignore the pandemic completely. I'm not presenting any numbers on COVID because they cannot be trusted. We know that for sure. And the government also didn't introduce any measures of economic relief to help neither the businesses nor the people. But what we saw is that actually GDP contraction was much less than we expected. It was only minus 2.6% in the second quarter. How did that happen? That happened because The government created incentives for state-owned enterprises not to contract their output. Of course, there was no market to sell that output to, and the state-owned enterprises accumulated huge inventories. They also accumulated huge losses and huge debts, and this is right now a source of financial risks for the whole country. What we saw on the micro side is that in the second quarter, half of the respondents of our rapid survey replied that their incomes have decreased, and if in April and the beginning of May, it was mainly due to the fact that they were working, these were people mainly working in services, and their revenue flows decreased significantly as people reduced their mobility, even though the government didn't make any restrictions. Then what we saw in the end of May and in June is that mostly hit was the manufacturing, and this is because of the fact that manufacturing exports to Russia, and Russia went into lockdown in May. So what we have right now is a very slow recovery, and the result of the policies that were implemented is exactly that the recovery would be very slow. We are now with this financial baggage of bad loans, which create also financial risks for the whole economy. And of course, another consequence of these policies was 6,000 excessive deaths we had in the second quarter. During the second wave, unfortunately, the policies do not change. So we expect to see even sadder results in terms of deaths. And as for the economy right now, political crisis probably influences it much more, as we have no trust to the government and no certainty, which basically precludes economic development. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Katya. Can I ask Mikhail to be the next speaker? Thanks. Yeah. Mikhail, you need to unmute your mic. We don't hear you. No, still no. Okay, Mike, Mikhail, could you please, okay,
yes,
now
yes,
it works,
I think
great.
it's unmuted, right? And I'm sharing my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So this should work now, sorry. Thanks a lot, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. I guess it's fair to say that the story of the development of the pandemic in Poland has been a mixed one. And that's a mixture both on the development of the pandemic itself and in terms of the response to the pandemic by the authorities. Now this is a sort of time ruler that summarizes the story, both in terms of the numbers of infections and in terms of the policy response to the pandemic, both on the socioeconomic side and in terms of the how strict the school closures were during the academic year. And as you can see, the reaction of the Polish government in the spring has been very decisive and very strong. And that limited the initial explosion of infections. Now, at the same time, if you look at the later months, Poland has been one of the worst performing countries, both in terms of the number of infections and in terms of the number of deaths in the autumn. And that was then met again with a new wave of restrictions. Now, I think it is useful to look at this calendar and to see the development of the pandemic also bearing in mind the parallel political developments. And first, the pandemic hit at the time when there was a presidential election campaign going on, and there was significant turmoil in the early months as to whether, how, and when to organize the vote. The vote eventually was postponed from May to July, and the incumbent president won the second term. What followed was internal government arms wrestling and a very significant reshuffling of the government that happened in early October. And finally, in the midst of the fast-spreading pandemic on October 22nd, the politicized constitutional tribunal took a decision to effectively ban abortion in Poland. And that has been met with the largest street protests we have seen in the post-war history of Poland, called the women's strike, and the protests continue. So these developments, in my view, are important in the sense that they have clouded a clear strategic response to the virus, and especially in the summer meant that the authorities focused their attention away from planning for the autumn wave. This, on the other hand, meant that the autumn wave of the pandemic could develop in schools, which essentially opened as if nothing had happened. And it developed against a seriously insufficient testing capacity and a very unclear testing strategy. So the numbers grew quickly. We had recently about 20,000 cases per day. Now they are down to about 10,000. But the number of deaths due to COVID, which are identified as COVID-related, are still at about 500 per day. But what has been a particular challenge in Poland was that the number of excessive deaths that we observe far exceed the number of those that are identified as COVID deaths. And that exposes, I guess, the highly insufficient healthcare facilities and an overall suboptimal healthcare strategy and preparedness for the second wave. So we've had a lot of infections in the last few months.
Michał, I'm afraid you would need to wrap up.
I'm wrapping up. So the economic response was very quick and rapid in the early months, and in the follow-up of that, the numbers in terms of both the growth and unemployment have not been too bad compared to other countries. The challenge that is left for the government is primarily the public debt, which is getting close to the limit of 60%, which is a constitutional requirement. So there are many challenges, both on the labor market and in terms of fiscal policy. And we need to remember that the government, even if the pandemic is over, the government will be left with significant debt and other consequences, including the healthcare sector and the school sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michał. Can we now turn to Georgi?
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
I will,
for sure. Thanks.
I will share a slide. Because of the time constraints, I will briefly tell you about the developments that have happened in Georgia in 2020, and maybe in Q&A I will address the decisions and responses implemented by the government in terms of economic policy. So here what we see is initially in the first quarter, Georgian economy actually showed growth. On average, it was a little bit above 2%. Then at the end of March, specifically on 21st of March, the state of emergency was introduced. You see that the stringency index is at the highest point for about 2 months in that period. The introduction of state of emergency immediately impacted the consumer and business confidence, and they ended up being at lowest points since IZPI is calculating these indices from 2015. The GDP growth, this is a month of 2020 versus the respective months in 2019, we see that in April, May, and June, we had on average 13% decline in GDP. Then, as by the beginning of July, end of June, the economic activity economy was opened, and that affected the expectations of both businesses and consumers. We saw some positive trends in the perception and prospects regarding the future economic development. But unfortunately, sometime at the end of August, Georgia started to see a very sharp increase in COVID cases, as you see by the blue area here. And that led to deteriorating business confidence, mostly because of the expectation component of it. And finally, after the elections, just a couple of weeks ago, the government further introduced basically something very close to lockdown, but not at the scale it was in March and April. So to summarize regarding the prospects of the future, GDP forecasts for this year range somewhere between -5% to -6% by different institutions, and we are expected to see in next year, in 2021, a recovery of 4 to 5 percentage points compared to 2020. And finally, a couple words about the sectors that have been hit the most. This is, as you would expect, the accommodation and food services industry, where the deviation from our predicted values for the first two quarters is -35%. The next most hit sector is construction, -31%. Then comes arts and recreation with -21%. And below, we have three industries which also play an important role in Georgia's economy. You see wholesale and retail trade. For the first two quarters, business sector produced 16% less output compared to predicted values based on previous trends. Transportation dropped by 15% and the manufacturing by 11%. That's in short what I wanted to fit in this 4 minutes, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions and discussing government responses next.
Many thanks, Georgi. Can we ask Alona now to be our next presenter? Thanks. We still don't hear you. Could you please unmute?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Great, thanks.
You see my presentation? I have a couple of slides. So in Ukraine, the infection rate is rapidly growing now, and in spring we have a quite good situation. Ukraine passed the spring wave.
Sorry for interrupting. Can you please hold the mic closer to your mouth because we don't hear you that well.
Okay, now better.
Marginally better.
Really? Just a moment.
Maybe you can speak a little louder then. Thanks.
Okay, so in spring, Ukraine passed the wave of the infection quite easily due to the strict lockdown, but in the fall, the situation sharply deteriorated. And you can see the chart. In Ukraine, compared to most countries in Europe, we have relatively few tests, and because of this, one of the highest rates of case detection. This is the story which is close to Poland. By now, still the number of confirmed cases as a ratio to the population is not so high, and the mortality rate also remains relatively low. But also, I can say that the situation is close to what we observe in Poland, that the excessive death rate is higher than what we observe officially from the COVID mortality. Now 12,000 of people have died, and the death toll may reach 33,000 according to our model if no any new restrictions are implied. But as we know, European countries have introduced new restrictions, and it helped them to reverse the trend of spreading the infection. You can see this in my chart. The dark blue line is Europe, but Ukraine is still thinking. We have the so-called weekend quarantine now, and there is the discussion on the introduction of the new lockdown. But even this quite mild weekend quarantine is facing a very strong rejection from the businesses, and many do not want to follow the rules. So in Ukraine, we have an enforcement problem, and the problem is that the government doesn't want to make unpopular political decisions. But now they still promise to introduce the lockdown at the end of December. And according to experts' estimates, it may be too late because by this moment, the burden on the healthcare system is expected to be extreme. Now, as regards the economic activity, you also can see in the chart that this chart is quarter over quarter. That the drop in the second quarter was significant, but then we had a quite good recovery in third quarter, and PSE projection for this year is the decrease, the drop in GDP slightly above 5%, depending on the severity of expected restrictions, and also our estimate of the local lockdown in Ukraine in the second quarter is 0.3% of GDP. Now the government announced the planned preliminary supportive fiscal measures. They promise cash allowances for workers under temporary pay cards, for self-employed, and for small businesses that are affected by restrictions. Then also self-employed will be exempt from paying social security. Yes, and firms in the affected industries as well. Firms will also have a discount on rent and state property. Then self-employed and small businesses may have be exempted from paying taxes for several months. And will also obtain some payments for children if they stay home with them. So this is this sounds quite good, but we will see the volume, for example, on the volume of this measure. And monetary policy now is,
I'm afraid I would ask you to wrap up. Thank you.
Yes, that's actually the finish. So. Yeah. Now the question is about financing. In spring, Ukraine introduced a special fund to finance these spendings, and there are still some money there which may be redistributed. So the main question now is the timing and strictness of the lockdown.
Okay. Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Natalia Volchkova. Natalia? Okay. Yes. Can you please unmute yourself? Yeah, thanks.
So, do you see my presentation now?
Yes, and we hear you also. Thanks.
Sorry.
Not any longer.
Yeah. Okay. I will present a bit of information from what's going on in Russia with respect to COVID. So we are somewhere at the upper part or at the top of second wave of new cases, which are now almost 3 times bigger than it was at maximum in May. And now there is a lot of extension of the new cases in regions. In May, it was mostly in Moscow. Now regions experience fully the effect of COVID-19, and death and new cases increasing very fast. But the situation is different across Russia, and different state of emergency at regional level is now, it ranges from dark green, that is more or less a stable situation, to orange. There are no red yet. As far as economic performance is concerned, this economic activity indicator, which weights purchases by population and transportation activity and electricity consumption and some others, show that in 2020 we are steadily perform worse than in 19 starting from March. So there is stable gap in performance over time. Unemployment decreased, so official unemployment increased due to rise in the unemployment benefit that was introduced in spring. And growth forecast for the economy by different sources, by different organizations, ranged from -10 to -4%, with 4.5 decline over the year is the average. And as far as support measures are concerned, so there were several type of government measures over spring and summer, which accumulates to 3.2 trillion of rubles, which is around 4% of GDP. And this support comes in form of tax reduction, subsidies and wage support, social support, and credit guarantees, which more heavily targets corporate sector, being the corporate sector gets 2.1% of GDP in this type of supports, the various types of supports, while household income was secured by 1.6% of GDP. By modeling estimations of National Bank, this type of support, 3.7% of GDP, provided some backup for GDP growth, which might be evaluated at 1.8 percentage point. That's prevented GDP from dropping even more due to economic crisis impact. That's it. Thank you for your attention. And
thank you very much, Natalia. Thanks. That was very informative. And now we would like to hear Sergey Gubin on the situation in Latvia.
Right. Hello from Latvia. So we are in the middle of the second COVID wave. On the graph up in the right, you can see a number of new registered cases, and it is hard to even notice the first wave, which happened in spring, just like everywhere in Europe. In fact, I should say that listening all those presentations, it seems like the Latvian case follows and mirrors experiences from other countries, for example, in Poland. So in a big picture, the country has the third lowest rates of mortality and infection in the EU. So we're relatively successful at the moment. But at the moment, the infection or mortality rates over the past 2 weeks, so very short period of time, is quite dramatic, and we are similar to the level of Germany, let's say. So it's relatively bad. Here, 45% of all cases are in Riga. So geographically, the spread is concentrated in the capital city, but also in some other regions, and I will talk about it later. On the graph below, you see mobility trends data from Apple, which basically illustrates what's happening in an economy. So there was a big drop in the very beginning of epidemics, and now goes down again with the rise of new infections. We had two emergency situations, one in spring and one is still ongoing. The very first emergency situation was way stricter to my mind. So we didn't have lockdown, but we had 2 rule, so 2 meters for 2 persons max gathering. So we closed borders in airport. Riga Airport and Air Baltic were not operational for 1 month, and was quite unprecedented. We had closed schools, universities, kindergartens, and cafes were open, and there were no masks. At the moment, this current emergency situation started just a month ago, in the middle of the second wave, so to say. So you can feel that the attitude toward the pandemics, toward COVID, is slightly different at the moment. It was very quick. The reactions were super quick in the first time, and now they're very flagging. And I'm not sure it's about politics, actually. It might be something to do with the attitudes of society in general. So what we have now as a rule, we don't have lockdown, and from tomorrow there will be a rule of 2 over 2 rule again, just like in spring. We have compulsory mask everywhere from tomorrow. Takeaways only, that's for cafes and restaurants. Airport and borders are open, they're operating, but people have to have this 10 days self-isolation. And at schools, 5th to 12th grades children, they have to learn on distance via Zoom. So the regional story looks like this. So it's, as I said, mostly around Riga in the center of the map, but then there are hotspots all around. And then projection economic GDP growth is decline is -7, unemployment is 7, and economic measures are downtime benefits, tax holidays, sick leave benefits for parents with young children on distance learning, and some regional restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey. Is it okay? Yes. Thanks a lot. That was very, very interesting. So what I suggest we do now, we turn to the questions and answers part of our session. So I would start with my questions. I will ask, say, a question per panelist, and then we will get questions from the audience. I don't have any particular order in which I will ask questions, so I will just basically try to follow the order of presentations, maybe to some extent. But while my questions will be somewhat specific, I suggest other panelists that also have something to add to it are most welcome to participate. Last but not least, please try to be relatively compact in your answers. So my first question is to Katerina, and I mean, it's a pretty obvious question, right? So, and you mentioned this in your presentation, but I still would like to hear what you think about it. So to which extent, what is the connection between the management, or I may even say mismanagement, of the first wave of COVID in Belarus and the political crisis that resulted in the electoral crisis in August? Is there any connection? If yes, could you please elaborate on this? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Of course, I'm not a political analyst, and you will have a political analyst from Belarus in the last panel, so he will be better at answering this question. But I may say that, of course, everyone was very unhappy, and that was at least a push towards reconsidering their choices, right? Because what was, it was not just because Belarus did not introduce lockdowns. It was because of these lies and disinformation that people received instead of answers and honest explanations of what was going on, right? So just to give you an example, I mentioned 6,000 excess deaths in the second quarter, the official number of deaths from COVID is 15 times less, 15 times. So imagine the amount of lies, and everyone understood that. Of course, that generated huge amount of distrust, and that might be the cause of what happened next. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I mean, I would like to somewhat follow on this topic. And I think my question is primarily to Georgie and Alena, but maybe also Sergey definitely also mentioned something that was relevant to this. So in my understanding, both Georgia and Ukraine were largely untouched by the first wave of COVID if we think of health-related things, if we think of mortality or exposure to disease. However, government policies were very restrictive. So I think Georgia demonstrated us this government response stringency index as provided by our World in data. So among the countries that we are discussing, Georgia had the strongest response, the most restrictive policies, and Ukraine was the second strongest in March to May 2020. So how did population perceive these measures? Did they see them as the reason for why the infection rates were so low? Or did they see them as unnecessary restrictions that were undermining economic activities? Or to put it differently, how was the trust in government affected by the measures in the first wave of COVID, and what implications it has for now, for the second wave? I don't know, you choose who is the first one to answer this, Alena or Georgie?
Yeah, I will start, if you let me. Yes. In March, when the lockdown was just introduced, people were really frightened by the news coming from the world, especially from Italy, and by this great uncertainty. And we have done research on this topic using poll data and tracking people sentiment from the beginning of this coronavirus story. And what was really interesting and impressed us that even in the end of January, when there was no any confirmed case here in Ukraine, people reported very high level of fear of contracting the disease. And this level of fear was stable and high till the end of March. But then in April, it started to go down. But still in March until May, people and businesses relatively strictly follow the restrictions because there was a hope that this will help the pandemic to disappear. But as the time was going, people and businesses became very tired of these restrictions, and by that moment, everybody realized that we would have to live with it. So businesses announced that they didn't want to suffer anymore because, in their opinion, it makes no sense. And now, as I said already, the government is afraid of unpopular measures, so we don't have strict restrictions now. So my main idea is that in spring, there was a consensus in the society that we need to stay at home to save lives, but there is no such consensus now.
And how is it in Georgia, Georgi?
Let me divide this in three stages. So when the first lockdown was introduced, the main emphasis was on health situation and COVID spread. And as the lockdown worked in that regard, so we basically had like single-digit cases for a very long period of time, the government and the health sector, public representatives of the health sector, they were close to worshipped by the majority of Georgians, and much less discussion was about the economic loss that we were incurring during those months. Then the next stage is probably like leading up to parliamentary elections, which we just had at the end of the October. So there the government basically did not introduce any further restrictions, probably because of political pressure. This was the time when the end of August, in September, when the virus, this so-called second wave, came to Georgia. And after that, basically until today, this myth of very well-managed process has been disappeared. So now there's much more emphasis about the impact on the economy, what losses we're expecting, etc. But now, as the elections are over, government became, I guess, more that does not take into account that much the perceptions that will be there from the public, and therefore they introduced a quite strict lockdown until the end of January. So we are now entering the second phase of close to complete lockdown, when there is no public transportation, schools have moved all to online, there's only takeout from restaurants, and most of the services are not operating in Georgia. And even though now we have like much many cases than we had in March and April, the public, in my perception, is much less tolerant towards these restrictions that are introduced nowadays than they were towards the initial, because then it was much uncertainty, both for the government and for public. We didn't have much data. And now I think government is getting more negative reaction, but at the same time, government cares less now because elections are over. So that's what's happening, I think, in Georgia.
Thanks a lot. Does anyone want to contribute, to say something on the situation in their countries?
Well, in Latvia, that basically was the same, just that the panelists just described. At the beginning, society and in general, and the government in particular, were, I would say, blinded by fear. They went all the way to, at least in Latvia, in case of Latvia, to closing borders and shutting down airports. So it was, I guess, more or less supported by the society in general. But now, as the time goes by, it seems like there are questions about exactly about economic aspects of the situation. So yeah. The same story.
Okay, thanks a lot. Somewhat following on Latvia perspective, and maybe also on Poland, as Sergey has mentioned, there is quite a bit of similarities in the way countries managed the pandemics. So both Poland and Latvia have implemented very strong stimulus and compensation package, right? And as has been mentioned by both Mikhail and Sergey, that has been associated with large costs. So we would have increased budget deficit. As far as I recall, in Poland, it went from the planned 1% to something like 9% budget deficit. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. And I am sorry, I'm not updated on the Latvian figures. But we are probably, I know that Latvia was not much indebted before the COVID, and now the debt is much higher, right? So talking of costs, if one has to prioritize, where do you think the stimulus package should start? So should the stimulus first be targeted to the support of employment or support of population? Should it be targeted to small businesses? Should it be targeted to investment in infrastructure? There is also a lot of discussion that this is the stimulus measures are our chance to shift to greener economy. So where do you think is the best where is the first use of money in that situation, based on the experience of your countries in the first phase?
If I may, I think the extent of the support and the form of support relied very much on the perception of how long the crisis will continue. And I think initially the perception was that it's going to be a relatively quick lockdown, quick and short lockdown. The government was prepared to roll out a lot of support policies for the initial 3 months of the very strict lockdown measures. As you said, the public deficit this year in Poland will be about 9% of the GDP, and it's expected to be relatively high also in the coming years. As to what should be supported and how the government should support the economy, the Polish package has actually been quite comprehensive. If you only consider the package that was introduced in the spring, a lot of support went towards the labor market, towards wages, towards tax relief. But on the other hand, there was a package called Financial Shield, which provided liquidity and loans for all sorts of companies, both the largest ones and the smallest ones, with different packages for different sectors and different companies. And the government is now planning another package of support, which is much more targeted. Currently, it looks like the government is essentially hitting a budget constraint in terms of how much it can support the economy. It still, in my view, is working along the lines that we can come back to normal and focusing largely on supporting jobs and supporting continuation of protecting employment in the companies that keep operating. The question is, of course, how long it can continue and how long that is how much is it sustainable, given the various relatively strict limitations on public borrowing that we have in Poland. The Polish economy has also been supported by monetary policy, and that's the case in other countries as well. But there, I think the limitations are even more substantial. Rates are basically at zero already, and the monetary policy is likely to be less effective in the coming years. Thank you.
Sergey.
Right. That's my personal opinion, so I think the situation with the support, the economic support, transformed over time in Latvia. At the very beginning, the main focus was on enterprises and firms to help them so-called hibernate during pandemics. And I think now there is more and more shift towards population, towards labor market. And that's partly economics, but partly epidemiological measure. People need to have stable financial resources. They need to have money to follow epidemiological guidelines. To have some certainty. Unfortunately, that was missing in the first wave, and then I think that's partly influenced the attitudes we have in Latvia now, and many people are skeptical about the constraints. To provide support for the economy, politicians and policymakers need to think not only in terms of economic GDP, but also whether those measures can affect epidemiological situation to some way. So, answering your question, I think support for the labor market, unemployment benefits, downtime benefits, support of parents with children on distance learning, for example, that's really important. And infrastructure investments, yes, we had those at the beginning, but I think now it's slightly less of priority. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Does anyone else want to contribute, to say something on this?
Yes, maybe I will.
Yes.
I will contribute a little. With Ukraine directed substantial funding to infrastructure projects. But here we're talking about not green projects, just road construction. Because here in Ukraine we still have quite poor usual road infrastructure. And there is hot discussion on this among experts here in Ukraine, because some say that this has higher multiplier compared to spendings which are aimed only at consumption. But on the other hand, we see that people are frustrated that the government spends money on roads instead of supporting them when they are in difficult situation. And I think their frustration is reasonable and need to understood. So I agree with Sergey that this crisis is more about people, supporting people right now, because the difficult situation is right now. It's not just usual recession. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let me get to the economic side of the crisis impact, and let me ask Natalia. So we know that Russian budget is to a substantial extent dependent on oil and gas revenues, right? So in a sense, it was misfortunate for Russian budget that the corona-driven drop in demand for oil and gas and resulting dip in prices coincided with the need for additional spending brought by corona, right? So in a sense, there are two burdens on Russian budget that happen simultaneously, well, for a reason simultaneously, but still. So basically, what was the impact of this? And do you think this impact is going to be long-lasting?
Yeah, so oil price is pro-cyclical, so to this crisis, so it's not surprising that we observe it sharp decline. In spring, however, it's recovered at news of vaccine positive development, and we see it's immediately increased substantially. So given these expectations of medium-term economic recovery potential because of availability of vaccine, we can expect that oil price will be okay, and so even previous decline in oil price was not below, not far below the level of cutoff level of Russian budget rule, and this is important. So the previous years that Russia was strictly attached to budget rule allowed to have safe budget situation and macroeconomic stability. Inflation and budget deficit was at minimum, and was almost budget deficit non-existent. So this current situation definitely led to increase in budget deficit. The government expects that situation will be back to normal in terms of economic development, economic growth within a year. And actually, we did a survey of exporting firms over COVID, and we find their expectations quite even more optimistic that they can recover the production within a half a year. But exporters are the best firms in the economy, so it's not maybe average situation. There are sectors that will not be recovered as fast, but there are also new opportunities that economy this situation brought. And for Russia, it is increase in distant work. Russia was far behind developed and some developing countries over a decade in terms of distant work. Now, just today, the law adopted, the law was approved, one which allows official distant work, and we see some potential for this, for some new economic potential from this distant work, like regional opportunities for regions to catch up with more developed areas of the country because of labor market pooling. So there are also some positive news brought by crisis in economies.
Okay, thank you. Let me return to the, well, it's in a sense a mix of economic impact and impact on population. So I think my question is primarily to Georgi and Alena, but maybe also to other participants. So what I'm thinking about is, so for example, in case of Ukraine, there is a sizable work migration to the EU. And that affects not only people that go to EU to work, but it also brings quite some money to the Ukraine. So I checked, and the size of remittances in Ukraine in 2019 was close to 10% of GDP. Right. I know that for Georgia, this number is 11%, but I'm not sure to which extent it is to the EU. and I'm not sure to which extent the travel restrictions that were brought by the pandemics affected the remittances and also associated migration. Can you maybe say something? What happened with this part of population, and what happened with remittances, and how did it affect the not only the people who work abroad, but also those that they send their remittances to?
Yes, you're right. There was a drop in remittances to Ukraine in April and May, and in May they were 20% less than in May a year ago, and there were quite negative projections regarding it. But starting June, they quickly recovered, and since July, they are on the same level in dollars, USD dollars, as a year ago. By this moment, from January to October, they are only 2% less than a year ago, and it's much better than many analysts expected in the spring. Why it happened? It happened because we saw that European Union actually needed Ukrainian workers, especially during summer, for these seasonal works and others. So these workers were allowed. The regulation for them was somehow changed, relaxed, and we see that the regulation and the markets adjusted to this new reality in favor of both the European Union economy and the Ukrainian economy. So in this regard, Ukraine didn't suffer much.
Georgi, do you have anything to say on this?
Yeah, just to quickly add a couple statistics. So in case of Georgia, first of all, European Union countries, the remittances that we receive from European Union countries is 40% of our total remittances. And actually during first, let's say 10 months, there has been an increase in remittances coming from European Union and as well as overall. So that's not something that was predicted. Remittances were seen as one of the source for worsening current account balance, but that forecast did not work the way it was supposed to, and actually we have a positive impact of remittances on our current account balance. The biggest hit in case of Georgia is through tourism, because tourism was a very significant part of Georgia's not just inflows but also important contributors to GDP, and that's basically the key driver the way we are hit right now. So it's not remittances, but tourism.
This is actually super good that you raised this, because I was about to ask. You gave us this comparison of how different industries were affected by the first shock, and if, as far as I recall, it was 25% drop in the tourism sector, right? It was really sizable.
So what I had was accommodation and food services,
Okay.
and we have, I guess that's not only in case of Georgia, it's hard to distinguish what portion of it is actually attributable to tourism and what is just domestic consumption. So we had more than a 30% drop. I think the right exact number was 35% drop in accommodation and food service industry. This is just the business sector output that I'm giving you numbers from. But then sometimes transportation, at least some portion of it is attributable to tourism, as you know, and we had roughly 20% drop there. And yeah, I think that's from my side.
Okay. Maybe I think we should wrap up this session right now. I would like to thank all of the participants. I think it was very informative, and it was interesting to see how, well, things that were probably seemingly somewhat different in different countries turn out to have a common pattern that we do observe both in countries that are somewhat richer, such as Poland and Latvia, and also in countries that were not exposed to that much to the first wave of the pandemic, but are facing it now. So to me, that was a very educating experience. Thank you so much for your participation. Thanks to the audience. And we meet again in 10 minutes, 7 minutes.
Hi, everyone. This is Pamela Campa from the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics. And in the next 40 minutes, going on with the theme of today, we're going to talk about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on gender inequality. So different experts from different areas, from academia, policymakers, experts from the media, have voiced concern about the fact that the COVID-19 crisis might be not only a physical health crisis, not only a mental health crisis, an economic crisis, but also very much a gender inequality crisis. And this is because there are concerns that along many dimensions, women might be impacted differently by this crisis than men. Starting from the very exposure to the virus, depending on the sector where women and men predominantly work. Think of the care sector, where there is a large concentration of women. Going to the impact of the measures that are used in order to contain the spread of the virus. Think of the school closures that increase the demand for homeschooling, which we suspect is going to affect women disproportionately, given that in many countries, mothers take more responsibility for children than fathers. And all the way to the impacts of the different policy measures that are used in order to address the economic effects of the crisis. So today we're going in the next 40 minutes to look at all these dimensions through the lenses of the Eastern European countries in our free network and Armenia as well. And to this end, we have gathered a very interesting panel of experts, one representative for each country. And I'm going to introduce to you very quickly our representatives. So we have Sergei Gubin from Biceps and the Latvia Parliament. Monika Owskowska from Senea in Poland. Then we have Jaroslava Babic from ISET in Georgia. Alexandre Grigorin from the American University of Armenia in Armenia. Olga Kupets from the Kiev School of Economics in Ukraine. Natalia Volkova from Cephir at NES in Russia. And Maria Perrotta Berlin from the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics here in Stockholm. Welcome, everyone. And I will start asking you some questions. And while we discuss the questions that I will ask the panelists, everyone, of course, in the audience is more than welcome to ask more questions that I will then pass to the panelists at the end of our discussion. And let me start with the differential impact potentially by gender of the very health crisis. So Global Health 50/50 has, since the beginning of the pandemic, published statistics on infection rates and mortality rates by gender. And looking at this data, one thing that emerges when we focus on Western European countries is that since the beginning of the pandemic to this day, women and men have been pretty much converging in terms of infection rates, but conditional on being infected, there is a significantly lower mortality rate among women. Now, another thing that emerges when one looks at the Global Health 50/50 data is that in Eastern Europe, it is much less likely that statistics are presented in a disaggregated manner by gender. And Monika, you recently, in a talk that you gave at one of our events, mentioned some data on mortality in Poland by gender, whereas on the Global Health 50/50 website, they report that Poland did not report disaggregated statistics in November 2020. So I want to ask you, what more data can you bring to the table that we can't find on the Global Health 50/50 data set, and how does the situation look in Poland in terms of gender statistics?
Yes, thank you, Pamela. Let me start with saying that on the 5th of October, Polish government decided not to publish disaggregated statistics of COVID deaths anymore due to lengthy reports. However, the data is available on request. And what we observe currently and also throughout the whole pandemic is that the gender ratio in COVID deaths in Poland is very similar to other Western European countries, which is more or less 40%. However, a very important concern I would like to raise here is that COVID deaths, at least official COVID deaths, are not the only ones that we need to worry right now in Poland. So actually, during this wave of the pandemic, one of the problems are excessive deaths we've been observing since the beginning of October and also in November. By excessive deaths, I mean the number of deaths we see in October, for example, this year as compared to the average number in October in previous years. And actually in Poland, we see twice as many deaths currently than in previous years. And the gender aspect is here very important since there are more excessive deaths among men than among women, especially in older age groups.
Okay, very interesting. Thanks, Monica. This was a very interesting contribution to the data that we can find, that I could find at least so far on global health 50-50. So now let us move instead to the consequences, the labor market consequences of the crisis. So the labor market aspect. So the COVID Inequality Project, which is hosted by some researchers at University of Zurich, finds, for instance, that in countries such as UK or the USA, women have been, throughout the pandemic, significantly more likely to be fired, to lose their job, which is interesting for economists because this is in contrast to previous crises where men will lose jobs at a higher rate than women. So this is, someone has said this time it is different. And a few of you have worked on this area, and I would like to start from Yaroslava, who has been looking at labor market statistics throughout the pandemic in Georgia. And Yaroslava, I would like to ask you what you learned about how things are going for women and men in Georgia, and whether you think that in Georgia we can talk about the gender inequality crisis together with all the other crises that we're dealing with at the moment.
Pamela, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, the data in Georgia labor market during the lockdown period in this spring, this year spring, was quite alarming. In quarter 2 of this year, we see that the data recorded, for example, 16,000 more unemployed people, and of these extra unemployed people, 14,000 or 90% were women. And the situation is more alarming when we look at the loss of hired employment. So during the lockdown in spring, we see 44,000 less hired workers compared to the same period last year, and 99% of them were women. So the reasons behind this are quite clear. The closures directly affected the types of sectors in which women were more heavily represented, and perhaps represented in the kind of jobs that were more vulnerable, so that they were cut or eliminated first. So these could be part-time contracts or temporary contracts, informal arrangements, etc. And I'm speaking of sectors such as restaurants, hotels, cafes, also retail, shopping centers, arts and entertainment. In Georgia, these are the sectors where women are the large shares of women employees. So another sector that suffered significantly during the lockdown was the paid domestic care. Nannies, cooks, cleaners. So 99% of these, according to ICPI estimates, are women in Georgia. And of course, as you mentioned, due to the lockdown, some women stayed at home, so they maybe didn't need these services. But then due to restrictions in mobility, simply these employees could not get to work. And the most alarming thing was that Georgia did not have social security or social safety net in place to help these employees. So essentially, Georgia does not have unemployment insurance. And it appears that COVID-19 really exacerbated the inequalities on the Georgian labor market.
Thank you very much, Yaroslava. I think this discussion or the points that you brought forward really shows why it's important that we look at these issues of gender inequality as a result of the pandemic separately in Eastern European countries. We don't learn only from the Western European countries, because as we know, the region is characterized by high levels of female labor force participation with the sectoral disaggregation as well, and also a welfare state which most of the times does not have the same instrument as in the countries that the current research has been analyzing so far. So the work that you're doing is very valuable in this sense. So now, speaking of high female labor force participation rate, I want to bridge to the next question by noticing that of the countries that I mentioned so far, if I look into the Economic Opportunity and Participation Index of the World Economic Forum Gender Equality Index, the UK rank 59, the US rank 26th, Georgia rank 61st, and this is out of 153 countries. Now, Belarus ranks in 2020 with the new data 5th, out of these 153 countries, sorry. And this is thanks to the very high levels of female labor force participation and also the high representation of women in senior roles. So now, Liev, you and Berok have over time regularly surveyed a sample of the population in Belarus to learn about their labor market experience. So I will be interested in hearing what you learned about women labor market experiences throughout this period in Belarus in this highly, relatively speaking, gender equal context. What has been happening there?
Well, so because we didn't have official lockdown, we didn't have all industries closing at the same time, we observed some interesting dynamics in gender inequality with respect to COVID. In the very beginning, in April, May, women were the most represented people among those who lose jobs and those who lose incomes. Because in Belarus, women are highly concentrated in two sectors: hospitality, so services, restaurants, hotels, and public jobs, so teachers, some clerks, etc. So these are two sectors. One is the safest, and another one was the most affected by COVID. So in the beginning, women suffered more, but then later, as economic crisis started to develop, men joined them and actually caught up. So by the middle of summer, we had pretty much equality in the rates at which people lose their jobs and equality at rates at which and sizes of incomes lost. So nowadays we are in this well, better equality situation, but it's again just if you look on aggregate. If you look by particular sectors, then you would see that this vulnerability depends on sectors where women or men are more heavily concentrated. And you've mentioned welfare state. Unfortunately, we do not have the true welfare state, which means that we pretty much don't have unemployment insurance, and people who lose jobs, it's a much bigger hit for them.
Very interesting. So not a gender inequality crisis in Belarus, really, which doesn't mean, of course, that especially in Belarus, there is not a crisis right now. Thank you, Liev, for your inputs. And now let me go from actually a relatively speaking gender equal country to another one, but from one where basically there were no measures or restrictions taken against the COVID-19 crisis to another one, Latvia, where some measures were taken. So Latvia also ranks very highly in a number of gender equality indexes. In the overall index from the World Economic Forum, Latvia is in 2020 11th, and it's the first in the region. And also, one thing I find particularly interesting during this crisis for Latvia is that according to the European Gender Equality Index, Latvia is in the European Union the second country after Sweden for equality of women and men in the extent to which they care for family members, which, as we all understand, is another very relevant dimension during this period. So, Sergey, I would like to then hear from you how things have been looking like in terms of gender equality in the labor market or gender inequality in the labor market in another relatively gender equal country, especially on this dimension that in this crisis should be crucial.
Right, the pandemics hit hard the labor market, and as you mentioned, indeed, we were relatively equal in terms of house course divided between man and female. That's not the case anymore, especially, for instance, with the distance learning, and so there was quite an interesting dynamics to my mind at the beginning. The government basically did nothing to support those families with young children at home, saying that their own business, manage how they feel. That's not the case anymore due to some pressure from society. In fact, the government introduces right now the sick leave benefits for parents with children of 10 years or younger who have to stay home. So essentially, it's probably for the first time the government actually pays money to, let's be honest, mostly mothers who are staying with their children at home and help them to learn via Zoom. So essentially, that's a kind of a job on which is being paid. It's ad hoc, of course. It's only for 15 days this year and 15 days afterwards, only during economic crisis. But still, that's an interesting, and I actually have never heard of such a benefit somewhere else abroad. And there was a big discussion in the society actually about this. So that's, I think it's a good development actually.
Yeah, very interesting. And also what you tell us shows why this time the crisis is different, right? For what Yaroslava told us, women are focused in certain sectors that happen to be in, particularly in some countries, sectors where women tend to work, that were more hit by the crisis, such as the restoration sector, but also there is this dimension of people having to homeschool, and pretty much everywhere we've seen that these people tend to be predominantly mothers. So now I know that a few of you also have been looking into labor market statistics and exposure to the crisis along this dimension in your country. I wonder if any of you would like to add to the inputs from the panel.
I may briefly present our study on the Armenian labor market.
Please go ahead, Alexander.
Thanks, Pamela. We conducted a study based on the household level data collected in the second part of May in 2020. And we asked questions like, what determines employment decisions at a firm level from the gender perspective, or do male and female employees face equal chances to switch to a remote working regime, to be furloughed or laid off, among other questions. And to address such questions, we estimate a regression model incorporating a number of firm, household, and individual characteristics. And I can summarize the main findings and recommendations as follows. Women are more successful in sustaining or shifting to a remote working regime than men. In particular, the probability to switch to a remote regime is higher for women by 20%. As a suggested policy, tax incentives for switching to a remote working regime can mitigate gender unemployment imbalance in times of emergency. For example, a differentiated lower income tax for remote working workers can do this job. We do not observe a gender gap in layoffs during the emergency period. However, we do observe an excessive fraction of working women who have been furloughed. For women, probability of facing furlough is higher by around 10% if controlling for all other factors except industries. The difference decreases to 6% when controlling for industries as well. Still, the effect is highly significant, suggesting that women are exposed to furlough more consistently, which cannot be merely or partly explained by firm size, industry, type, or location. Next, our results suggest that work title does not lead to employment status changes between female and male in times of pandemic. The distribution of work title based on order classification seems to have no discriminating effect on employment-related decisions for women. And finally, regarding the role of industry, it has substantial confounding factor, compounding positive effect on switching working regime and negative effect on furlough. Generally, the role of industry structure of the Armenian economy in explaining gender gap in the labor market seems to be critical and deserves exploration in more detail. This is all.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And yeah, what you tell us about how relatively easier it is for women to switch to flexible work arrangements remind us that we don't have to look for a silver lining of this crisis. But if we wanted to, one thing that has been noticed is that firms were forced by the crisis to adopt more flexible work arrangements. And for a long time in the economics literature, we have been knowing that women tend to prefer this arrangement, and part of the gender gap in wages might come a substantial part from women's higher preferences for flexible jobs, which are not accommodated currently, or have not been accommodated, by corporations. So potentially some positive developments there, and we can come back to this later. I think, Olga, you wanted also to say something about the Ukrainian case.
Hello, thank you. Like in many other countries, Ukrainian women prevail in sectors with very low shutdown resilience or high economic vulnerability. And also they prevail in sectors which are critical for everyday life, such as healthcare and also education. So on the one hand, they are more likely to lose jobs, but on the other hand, they are also very likely to have their jobs, but also have very high risk, high exposure to the virus. And then we see that the number of job losses was much higher among women than among men. But then we look on the rates. As expected from the previous crisis, from the literature, women left the labor force more often than men, while men continued looking for another job. That is, the unemployment rate increased more for men, while labor force participation rate declined more for women. And if we look across age at this labor force participation rate dynamics and unemployment rate, it is interesting that not only young people were affected as usual during any economic crisis, but also prime age workers. And it is interesting that young men, not that young, but from 25 to 29, years, the decrease in labor force participation rate in this age group was larger among men than women. While in older age groups, women, we see a decrease in labor force participation rate and increase in unemployment rate among women. So we conclude that prime age women suffered a lot after they came back to the labor market in their 30s. They started business or some activity in sectors like retail, trade, services, hospitality, and now they are among the most affected. And another interesting finding from the analysis of key labor market indicators that the number of inactive people increased in relative terms among men and women almost equally. And we see that a huge increase of the number of discouraged people, especially among men, people who do not know where to search a job, who believe that there is no suitable job for them. And what is interesting, among dependents and among men. So it seems that men lose their jobs and they just leave the labor force, waiting for better times, while their wives probably stay, keep working at jobs with a high risk of virus spread.
Very interesting, thank you. So there are some households in Ukraine where a potentially female breadwinner model is emerging, which might or might not change the norms within the household. So it might be that women are exposed to triple burdens, double, triple burdens, unless the norms about the division of work in the household change. So I think that's an interesting development to follow. Very, very good. Thanks, Alexander and Olga, for your inputs. And now I would like to go to, let's go to Russia, actually. So, Natalia, in a recent talk that you gave at one of our events, you actually positively emphasized how throughout 2020, some gender equality statistics have been improving in Russia. So you had some good news. And then, of course, a natural question is whether we think that the COVID-19 crisis is going to accelerate or actually halt this progress that you identified. And in particular, I was looking at the data from the survey that you, with your institutions, run among exporters in Russia, and a large majority of exporters in Russia report that their way of coping with the crisis has mostly been switching to flexible work arrangements, including remote working. So in light of this, in light of the positive developments that you have emphasized during the year, how do you see the impacts of the COVID crisis on gender inequality, given the labor market structure and the division of roles in the households in Russia?
Thank you, Pamela. First of all, I want to say that the events and development of events with respect to gender that happened in other countries, neighbor countries, were also happening in Russia. So we do observe anecdotal evidence. Unfortunately, there are no good research so far, which there is no micro data on layouts and different other disruptions. But the way it is discussed now, it's quite similar in all our respects. At the same time, we do observe that some few positive signals in the area of gender inequality, and one of it is the substantial increase in Russian position in the ranking, which is done by MasterCard in women entrepreneurship. And Russia increased by 16 position in a year, and now it is the third country in this ranking among other 60 countries. So, and I believe there are several developments, some of them are due to COVID crisis, but some of them were already taking place in Russia. What COVID brought is the flexibility in labor market. That was Russian labor code is very rigid, and there was no option for distant employment and remote work in Russian labor code till today, when
Natalia froze.
Yeah, it's our internet. Let's move on.
Let me see. Yeah, let's give her
this
20
thing
seconds.
is now sorry.
Natalia, yeah, you're breaking. Your internet is breaking, so we lost you for a couple of seconds.
I see. Sorry. Yeah. So this Russian labor code changed as of today, and now this flexible arrangement remote work is possible. That definitely will have a positive impact, and this impact will be biased toward females. For women, now it's possible to be doing home your work and being employed simultaneously. That's great, and that will have positive. Another thing that started last year is a new form of tax arrangement for Russian citizens and allowed self-employment. And it is really a great thing for people who can do some small things, because it's up to some amount of income in a year, but it's quite reasonable. And there is almost zero entry cost on this type of arrangement. So you just download application from tax authority website, you register right away. If you register as self-employed, you do it immediately, you don't need any approval. So it's really a great thing, and it's all done online. So this kind of things makes, the good thing is just 4%. Income tax is 4% if you sell your services or goods to private people, and 6% if you work with corporations, both Russian, domestic, and foreign. So this thing is definitely, and this year, this type of regime is extended to the whole Russia. First, it was to only 10 regions. Now, whole people in Russia may do this. So, and we observe people switching to this tax regime because, of course, there is no social benefits from this, but you might pay for this additionally. And so I think all the developments will benefit, first of all, women, and we will observe change in this gender gaps in this type of entrepreneurship, small entrepreneurship, and which allows remote work.
Thanks a lot, Natalia, for offering these inputs, even in the absence of micro data. It's good to get the intuition of what we can expect from the developments. This is definitely one of our contributions here. And now, one dimension that, of course, we should not forget is that the COVID-19 crisis has been also identified as a potential domestic violence crisis. And our expert here in domestic violence is Maria Berlin-Perrotta from the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics. So, Maria, I was wondering whether you could just brief us about why there is this concern pretty much everywhere. We've read about it in the media, academics are working on it, on the impacts of the crisis on domestic violence, and also what the data from Sweden tell us.
Yes, thank you, Pamela. Indeed, as we heard, both the pandemic and the political reactions to it led to a lot of dramatic and sudden changes in many areas that we knew to be associated with conflict and violence within the households. So the lockdowns and confinement per se lead to families spending more time together, less availability of alternative options of things to do and places to be, both for violent individuals and for the potential victims. Also more isolation from social networks and from support organization. The economic shock, the spikes in unemployment also can cause an increase in conflict through the channel of economic insecurity and stress, but also since, as we heard, they affect asymmetrically men and women, both in terms of employment status and in terms of time spent on childcare and household chores. So these things can upset the balance of normal times division of labor within the household, and this can also lead to conflict. And since the crisis has created these very special conditions in terms of variation in these factors across places and time, this makes, of course, for a fertile ground for research. And in fact, we see a growing number of studies on domestic violence from this period. And in most cases, I have to say, the evidence is consistent with what we would expect. So more time at home leads to more violence, more unemployment leads to more violence, more financial stress leads to more violence. Of course, there are exceptions that clearly depend on the context. And Sweden is an interesting case to study because there was no strict lockdown. as we know, just like in Belarus, the authorities relied on voluntary compliance, but this nevertheless, this has nevertheless led to changes in mobility patterns, and therefore we see mobility patterns associated again with increases in conflict and domestic violence, so even in this context. And I want to mention that we also have a project on the region, which is very important, because the situation, the issue of domestic violence is of totally different proportion in many of these countries, unfortunately. So for instance, the Human Rights Ombudsman for Russia suggested that the number of emergency calls about intimate partner violence in Russia might have increased by 150%. And this can be compared to an estimated increase by 60% in Europe. So it's more than double. And at the same time, the situation with data availability, as we also heard, might be a little bit more challenging in many of these countries. So, for example, again, in Russia, there is a huge unaccounted for discrepancy between survey data and official statistics on domestic violence. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to work more and learn more about domestic violence, and our network is of course a great asset in this, and I am really looking forward for cooperation on developing this project.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria. So first of all, we see that this is something that we should be very concerned about. And thanks also, yes, for reminding us or for emphasizing that we as a group within the Free Network and the FROGI Network are definitely going to do more work in trying to understand also the domestic violence implication in the region. So maybe in the future we will have for sure some publications and potential events where we can discuss this. But for now, for this event, we do have a question from the audience, and I think, let me check the question, from Anna Burduli. Sorry, Anna, if I mispronounced your last name. So I'm going to read this question. This is for all of you, and we have 3 minutes left. So whoever feels that can cover this in a very short time, please go ahead and talk about it. You can think while I read the question. So Anna, tell us, what policies do you think have proven to be the most efficient for women economic empowerment? From your perspective, what are the specific challenges that women-led enterprises are facing in times of COVID? And do you have any policy recommendations for overcoming these challenges? So who wants to offer some thoughts about this?
Well, I can say some thoughts. Actually, I would say that it's a good question, but it's rather hard to answer, because when we talk about efficiency in times of such crisis, part of efficiency will be determined at the end when we will see how many people will die with this or that policy. For example, when we talk about women empowerment and gender equality, I think very important thing is housework, and most importantly is who sits with a child. In our countries, it is mainly women, so it would be reasonable to think about some policy, some instrument that will help women with that. Well, we know that instrument is kindergarten and school. What we don't know is what is more efficient in terms of fighting COVID. Should we have schools? Should we close them? Should we make them work in some very specific arrangements? It's very unclear, so it's hard to say what is efficient. For sure, governments should think about this situation and should do something. For example, in Belarus, mothers always were spending much more time sitting and teaching their children, and now during COVID, time that women spend increased by more than time that men spend with their children. So it's really hard.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Liev, and that emphasizes what are the trade-offs and the very difficult choices that the policymakers need to do right now. So I think we need to wrap up this very interesting discussion. I hope that everyone in the audience understood why we had this section. I think even just in 40 minutes, we could emphasize the several dimensions along which women and men might have been impacted differently during this crisis, which in general tell us how important it is to always look at statistics by gender, because if we look at aggregate measures, we might be missing some important aspects of this crisis and the next ones, and in general of our arrangements in our societies. So I thank a lot all the panelists for being here and also for keeping in time. Thank you so much. And we start the next section in 5 minutes.
You may have thought that you had seen the last of me for today, and to some extent maybe I'd hoped so as well. But unfortunately this situation is springing yet another surprise on us. So Torbjörn Becker, the director of SITE, who was supposed to have moderated this last panel of the event, unfortunately got sick tonight. So from what I have learned, it's nothing COVID related, but we still keep his health in mind as we continue with the day and hope for a quick recovery. So that means that I have to take over this panel as well. So bear with me for another 15 minutes or so. Fortunately, I have good company. So in this last panel, we will focus a little bit more on the political and economic side of two countries in particular, Russia and Belarus, in the year of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, you know, some of the things that have been on my mind, in a sense, have to do with how has the pandemic affected, for instance, the political turmoil we are seeing in Belarus. How will it affect the political landscape we are seeing from now and looking forward in Russia? And how are the two countries linked together in terms of the political reactions in respective countries and how they kind of influence each other? So, you know, just listening to me thinking about this may not have been very useful, but fortunately I have two very eminent speakers with expertise in this area with me today, who can talk much more in detail about the developments in Russia and Belarus, both on the sort of political side and on the economic side. So it is my great pleasure to introduce, first of all, Elena Panfilova. So Elena is the founder and chair of the Center for Anti-Corruption Research and Initiative Transparency International, Russia. Since 2012, Elena is a member of the Russian Governmental Commission on the Open Government. And since 2007, she has taught anti-corruption at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, where she also established a laboratory for anti-corruption policy in 2009. She is currently the laboratory's deputy head. Our second speaker is Artyom Shraibman, who is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Moscow Center and political analyst based in Minsk, focusing on Belarus-related developments. He is a former political editor of the Tut.by website, the most popular non-state media outlet in Belarus, and he also writes frequently for Tut.by on Belarusian politics. He is also the founder of Sense Analytics, a political consultancy. So the plan for this talk then, or this part of the presentation then, is that Elena and Artyom will start with a roughly 10 minutes introduction. And after that, we will open up for a moderated discussion where I will take the lead, but where I also open up for questions from the audience. So please be present and please send us your questions using the chat function or the Q&A. So Elena, please, why don't you get started?
The members of our parliament keep coming out with more and more restrictive political legislation. The restrictions for the right on assembly, individual rallies, individual picketing will be now, they plan to make them more regulated starting coming year. A new iteration of the legislation of so-called foreign agents, and so far so on. So in a strange way, where you would assume that the political system will loosen up in order to unify the society, to seek assistance from different parts of society, from different parts of political spectrum, in order to overcome the results of pandemic and to overcome the whole economic, social, different types of instabilities in different parts of the regions. the system keeps pushing and pushing and pushing further on, restricting political and civic rights. And I can say that in my historic memory, nothing good ever came from such a strategy. And this is where we are now. And I think these three elements will be more and more visible in coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Artyom, please.
Thank you very much. Listening to Elena actually gave me a sense that there was no major crisis or even an event in which Belarusian and Russian courses of governance and behavior were so different from one another. It's actually Belarusian, government and the incumbent who did become more serious about the pandemic in the second wave and completely ignored or actually dismissed the problem during the first wave, which sort of caused them the political crisis and the uprising that we see now. And this is basically where I would like to begin, is that Belarusian political crisis has a lot of reasons, a lot of triggers that have caused it. However, the pandemic and the mishandling of the pandemic was one of the key ones of them. And the interesting thing here is that the pandemic itself as a topic is virtually not played out, is virtually not discussed these days in the society during the political crisis itself, because it gave the beginning to the sequence of events that led us to where we are now. And that is why my 10 minutes remarks will probably be more retrospective, because it is very interesting to observe how the autocratic system in which we in Belarus live, how it actually got stuck with this issue of the pandemic, and how it appeared to be citing this very much abused term, the black swan, for the one of the most seemingly stable dictatorship of the continent. I will have probably to start with the just general point that the pandemic, as you definitely have discussed today, the pandemic creates stresses for all the societies and all the governments all over the world, and it reveals their weaknesses and their flaws. In Belarus, Belarusian authoritarian regime state used to have a very specific paternalistic identity to it. So it's very different in this regard from the Russian authoritarian regime, because Belarusian government has presented itself always to be this kind of welfare, social justice state, the state that cares about the poor, the state that cares about the vulnerable, sort of left-wing paradise. But we are an authoritarian country, but at the end we guarantee some sort of equality and protection. This was at least the sell. They were trying to sell this identity. And the mishandling of the pandemic has shattered this image in the eyes of the very broad public. And this was not, that's what I want to be very clear about. This was not just the governance failure, because it was, I think what was even more important is that it was a huge communication disaster on behalf of the authorities. Actually, the polls that we have seen in spring polls, April, March, and even I think early May, have shown that Belarusians were not actually very supportive of the lockdown. So it was usually Lukashenko, Belarusian incumbent, is always criticized for not introducing any restrictive measures, any lockdown. Actually, there was not a demand in Belarusian society for a lockdown. In the polls that I have seen that were conducted in April and May, only about 25–30% were for some sort of restrictions of movement, some sort of lockdown measures. But the rhetoric and state-level deception, that what actually irritated a lot of people. Because first of all, Lukashenko and by extension his officials, his state TV, they were ridiculing victims, and actually blaming sometimes victims for the poor health that weakened their immunity, shaming people who wore masks, for example. And this approach, by the way, has changed during the second wave. Now the Belarusian government actively promotes masks wearing. There was also a lot of dismissal of the problem. Lukashenko has consistently emphasized how overblown the problem is, how this is like just another flu, and that all of this is some kind of international conspiracy, that big pharma companies are behind it. He was, playing with these conspiracy theories. But people saw that their relatives are becoming sick, that they sometimes die. And the doctors could not ignore this problem, and the doctors were sometimes contradicting the rhetoric of the state. And people saw these divergent narratives, these two narratives that is coming from what they see with their eyes and from what they hear from the state. And this reminded many Belarusians, and here we should also remember a more earlier history of our country. This reminded many Belarusians rather fresh memories of Chernobyl, because Belarus is probably one of the most affected countries by the Chernobyl disaster. And actually what was so traumatic is not just the disaster itself, but rather how the late Soviet government actually concealed the scale of the problem, how it put a lot of efforts into trying to suppress free flow of information and diminished the seriousness of this threat. And people sense that the same instincts of the current Belarusian authoritarian government play out today. There was also not enough support provided to doctors and to businesses who suffered from the even lack of lockdown, but still slowdown of economic life. The teachers were confused because the kids, the pupils of the schools were allowed not to go to schools, but they were still obliged to attend distant classes. So the teachers have to first work half the day online and then work half the day offline for those who go to school and don't go to school, and they were not, adequately paid for this. So this confused a lot of teachers, and this approach, this kind of mishandling of the pandemic, it irritated very broad constituencies of Belarusian society. Parents of school children, teachers, doctors, those who got sick themselves or got their relatives sick. This created this very, interesting kind of dynamic in Belarusian society where people became frustrated with the government. I mean, which was to be expected, but it was on the eve of the presidential election. And all of this frustration was just channeled into the political life. Political life of Belarus is not the political life of any other European state, of course. But even with this kind of autocratic, system, political campaigns matter. And it showed this year. Self-organization that emerged from the pandemic, when people self-organized crowdfunding, arranged crowdfunding to support doctors with PPI and other kind of, funds, even, just direct money and food and whatnot. This self-organization infrastructure that actually spilled over to the electoral campaign then. The leaders of the famous Buy COVID-19 initiative crowdfunding project basically now do the same crowdfunding, but for the victims of political repressions. And they have already accumulated like millions of euros of donations for this end. And then there was a hypocrisy. When the election campaign started in June and July, the government started to exploit the COVID topic to actually limit the political freedoms. So, for example, people saw that that COVID was not apparently dangerous enough to cancel the 9th of May Victory Day parade or to cancel the football tournament in the country. But at the same time, it was dangerous enough not to allow independent observers to observe the polls, the actual voting process. The government used this. Now it uses the COVID not to allow lawyers to visit their clients in prisons, usually political prisoners. And people saw this hypocrisy, and this became another, trigger that added to this mounting irritation with the state. So this this all has led us to the thing that I've briefly described, that new and new constituencies of Belarusian public that have never been particularly political have become politicized, have become politically angered and energized, and they entered the political field, sometimes not realizing what expects them. And what expected them was a very brutal authoritarian state with a very brutal toolkit of measures, arrests, beatings, tortures, and whatnot. And for these people, it was like the first time treatment. So Belarusian political opposition got used to this kind of treatment in a way. These people, for them, this was unexpected. And from this, we had the record-sized protests. We had the 4 month now of the uprising in Belarus. And so it all, always draws us back to this COVID issue, how it all, started back in spring. And probably Lukashenko now sort of regrets the way he spoke of the COVID that costs him probably the legacy, his political legacy at least. I'll stop here, and sorry if I overspoke my time.
Thank you very much, Artem. So I will try to go a little bit back and forth between you with question, but feel free, even if I address a question to one in particular, if you, the other person, also have an opinion on this question, please fill in and so on. So maybe just follow up on what you were saying, Artem, and make sure that I understand it correctly. But I mean, we have had free and unfree and unfair elections in Belarus before, and there have been protests, but nothing like what we have seen this time. And do I understand it correctly if you argue that the pandemic, in a sense, created a sense of lack of legitimacy for the kind of authoritarian bargain that the Belarusian government has been able to strike before with, you need to allow some political oppression here, but we're delivering you some economic goodies and some security. But we, with the COVID crisis and the mishandling of the crisis, they didn't manage to actually handle that situation. And also, I mean, I know that if Torbjörn were here, he would also ask something about, but what about the economy? Was there a role of the economy also in delegitimizing the government even prior to the COVID crisis as well? Or what do you say?
Well, of course, when I spoke about the COVID as one of the reasons of the current crisis, I mentioned that there were many more, and economy is probably another big problem of the late Lukashenko years, because the Belarusian economy has been stagnating for now about 11 years, I guess. Belarusian salary in terms of if you count it in dollars, have not grown since 2010 or maybe even 9. The problem is that the incumbent Alexander Lukashenko, he just lost the ability to produce positive agenda. So he does not propose any kind of, getting out of the crisis. And this became very evident during the pandemic as well, because when businesses, for example, needed help, when people who were losing their job needed help, Lukashenko was just able to say that, sorry, don't have money for you. He once, literally said that if you lost a job, find a new one. And this kind of detachment from the society is also a product of 26 years of, authoritarian rule and lack of, feedback, basically, and lack of proper political competition. But again, the pandemic, because as I've said, it aggravates all the stresses that existed in the society before the pandemic, before such event. It just got things infinitely worse. So economy was a huge underlying factor for what is happening in Belarus. But the pandemic just brought so many more new people into the pool of those who hate this government.
Yeah, and if I may add, I think this is partially the result of this ignorant attitude towards the pandemic on behalf of Belarusian incumbent, and maybe caused a little bit of scare among our political elites what to say and what not to say, because the general shock about how Belarusian society responded to the routinely falsified elections, what is happening, and that is happening here and there almost all the time. So nobody would assume that something what is happening regularly in the situation which is regularly controlled by the law enforcement, by electoral authorities, suddenly produced this huge bombastic result of the civic response. I think even in Russia, in many other countries where political elites are very much following this populistic line of what to say and what not to say to society, I think the lesson they learned from Belarusian incumbent that you better think what you say. And in our case, they prefer not to say anything now because it is safer. And this is probably partially the result of observation what is happening in Belarus right now.
So Elena, following up a little bit on that, would you say that maybe people in Russia, in the Russian opposition, or people in general, are looking with interest at what is happening in Belarus and see it as potential inspiration for being more politically against the government in Russia as well?
I'm afraid that right now there is no political opposition as such ready to pick up something similar to what Belarusian speedily emerged opposition and unified opposition did last summer. Unfortunately, our political opposition, the one which could definitely challenge the authorities, it is fragmented, it is under oppression, is under numerous legal proceedings, even those, and I can give you examples of very speedily rising female political leaders from the local level, from the municipal level, who within 1 year, because of their activism, including the pandemic response, became a federal, national politicians. They are now facing trials under very peculiar accusations. And the government does actually everything possible not to let any kind of unity, any kind of unified political forces similar to those which emerged in Belarus to actually have a unified response, and very carefully looking in that direction. They're very skilled in that. They maybe we don't like them, but they are not fool, right? they learn their lessons fast. And definitely there are political leaders who look in that, in those lessons. But will we be able to repeat anything like that in the territory which is 8 time zones? Hardly possible, in my opinion. Sorry to say that.
So Elena, you also mentioned something, if I understood it correctly, that in some ways the policy response to the COVID crisis has become more local than central. And that also gives, of course, an opportunity for local leaders to step up and show competence and become well-known figures, at least at the local level. Do you see any potential political opposition forming around some of these local individuals who are coming up and all of a sudden can maybe transcend the locality and become regional and maybe even national well-known figures?
I wouldn't call it necessarily opposition, but some new political faces. And we have problem with even with new political faces in the country for all reasons described above. There are some new political faces emerging from both among doctors, among business people who they help chains locally, similarly to what Artyom has described. There were networks helping people, helping doctors. We have people from non-governmental and philanthropic organizations who people know to address in the situation when they cannot find any help in any other source. Definitely there will be new leaders of opinion, but that any new leader of opinion or any new leader of action can become a new political phase. opposition or not, we do need the change of political elites. So it doesn't matter which ideological spectrum, excluding, of course, all the possible very right, right wing sides. It doesn't matter what the ideological spectrum they are going to be, but it's important that this is people who care about their societies, people who know that they have to act when they need to act. And we do see such people actually responding along with the systems which unfortunately happen to be not that well prepared to, even in the country with such a huge resources like Russia, not that well prepared to respond to the pandemic crisis.
Thank you, Elena. So, Artem, just coming back a little bit to the economy again. I'm trying to fill the role of Torbjörn here, as I said. So there is also, of course, an economic dimension in the sense of the capacity for the Lukashenko government to be able to sustain political power at the minimum, because the economy is constrained in the sense of they need to pay salary to the military, they need to pay salary to the security forces, they need to pay salary to workers in state-owned enterprises and so on in order to keep some kind of political legitimacy working and so on. And if not, that can create sort of fissures within the elite, I assume. So do you see anything like this happening? Do you think this is a binding constraint? Do you see anything happening within the elites and any different groups suggesting that maybe the strategy pursued is not successful and we need to do something different?
Well, of course, I mean, this is now the key hope of the protesting part of the society, that the economy will be the next, black swan for this government. Actually, the fact that Belarusian economy now is in this circumstance, in this condition where it needs constant foreign support, and just, I mean, small disclaimer, I'm not an economist in any way, and there are even economists online who are listening to us who are way more, smarter on this than myself. But Belarusian economy needs yearly, support from abroad, basically. Usually Russia has provided it. Not only, Belarus was able to diversify its credit portfolio, so to say, in the recent years. But now with all the other channels of funding basically closed due to the political reasons and lack of trust to the Lukashenko government, Russia is the only possible, funding partner. And this creates a lot of pressures in terms of Lukashenko's ability to, to resist Russian pressures, because he's now becoming more and more dependent. As you've said, if he refuses to concede on this or that Russian demand, there is a possibility that Russia just stops supporting his regime. And it would mean that in probably in a year or a year and a half perspective, Belarusian state will be not able to service its foreign debt. Default will trigger, domestic processes that I'm not sure that his government is able to control. Again, the siloviki, so-called, the law enforcement, the security services will probably be the last to feel the budgetary constraints. But as you've said, the struggling state sector of economy and the workers working there, many of whom were on the verge of striking due to the political reasons in August and September, if the economic disaffection joins this picture, it will be a lot harder for the police and factory administrations and local authorities to push these people back into their factory rooms and workplaces. So economy now is probably the key challenge for the regime. And as I've said, because of no ability even to produce the positive agenda of change in the economy and to get us back on the track of growth, I think this will be the key trigger of the demise of this political regime.
So following up a little bit on that, and also thinking about what other governments can do. thinking about Sweden and thinking about the European Union, for instance. So I was listening into a webinar recently organized by the Polish and Lithuanian embassies here in Stockholm, and there were members of the Belarusian opposition there, and there were also some Belarusians who were more independent from both the government and the opposition, and more there in an expert role. And there were discussions about the role of EU sanctions, for instance. And there I got the impression that people had slightly different opinions about who potential sanctions are actually hurting and how effective they can be in targeting the regime versus more hurting the sort of workers on the street, and what the political implications are. Whereas people from the opposition seemed more, perhaps from political perspective, very strongly in favor of putting more pressure on the government through these kind of sanctions and so on. So do you think these types of sanctions are helpful? Do you think they can be effectively targeted so that they have sort of minimal impact on people and maximum impact on the regime?
Depending on how you estimate efficiency and effectiveness. I mean, they send a strong signal of support. They delegitimize the regime internationally. They make it more costly for Russia to support it, which also leads to change in the Russian decision-making, because if Belarusian regime becomes more and more costly, given that Russian economy is itself not in the best condition, they might getting closer to the idea of pushing Lukashenko to resign. But there is no evidence of a direct impact that economic or any other sanctions have on the behavior of the regime. These people, unlike the Russian political and business elite, Belarusian political and business elite do not have accounts in the EU. They don't travel much. No, general Belarusian KGB will become softer because you freeze his opportunity to travel to Barcelona. This is not something that matters for these people, and economic sanctions will just further solidify, I would say, the vertical of power around this idea of now it's not just the domestic, but also the foreign assault that we are under. And it will further prompt Russia to frame it all as a geopolitical competition for Belarus, just as they framed the Ukrainian crisis. So again, sanctions is a double-edged sword. They help to delegitimize and raise the costs of the support of the regime for others. But I'm not sure that they are the silver bullet. They do not. I don't know of any historic example, and correct me please if I'm wrong, where sanctions have led to regime change. They have sometimes led to a policy correction. Some very tough sanctions on Gaddafi regime, on Iran, have led to them changing their course on some of the policies, nuclear proliferation and others. But to imagine that the whole regime change operation can be conducted via this kind of sanctions is just, I think, not feasible.
I think research is on your side when it comes to the effectiveness of sanctions for regime change as well. Elena, I mean, Russia has also been very much hit by sanctions for quite some time due to sort of military conflicts in Ukraine and so on. So what is your perceptions about that? And how do you think Russia would react to an increased demand for support from the Lukashenko regime? At what point will they stop feeding him and say that's enough?
Definitely difficult to say. What is possible to say is that there are obvious signals and signs that it is considered quite a toxic asset because you don't know what to do with it, like properly meaning that without causing yourself too much of economic trouble, because we also have scarce resources now, and to have this extra is not what you want to have, especially in the year which is hit by both drop of oil prices and COVID economic decrease, right? And on top of that, to have some extra spendings in the direction of Belarus is not something what really makes anyone happy, I think. Second, what is possible to say is that, nobody takes these sanctions among those in political and governmental elites as any danger. And I think they already shared that knowledge with some other people in other countries, that actually it's possible to live under sanctions. It's possible to organize everything in such ways that you still travel, your relatives still travel, and you have some assets abroad. And actually, I slightly disagree with Artem. There are some assets abroad of your guys, not all of them, but some do have certain things, but probably they hide it better, and they don't have it like in this splash type of luxurious villas everywhere. They just keep cash in the box, you know, like traditional way, but it is kind of box, not somewhere abroad. But yeah, sanctions, in my opinion, is more like act of sending a signal. But Russia, as you can see, lives under sanctions. Who cares? Big business, like really big business, which doesn't have the same type of opportunities to go to IPOs, to go to the investment promotion, and to attract foreign partners. That is true. That the top real business, not governmentally linked business, is really not happy about sanctions. The rest, they learn the lesson. We are under sanctions, starting the first group of sanctions. It's Magnitsky sanctions, basically more than 12 years now. And everyone knows how to live with that. And what I do believe is that Russia, at certain point, will have to make a decision, even for geopolitical reasons, even for the whole reasons of image, how long it is going to avoid making a clear statement what Russia thinks about what's going on in Belarus Republic. Because right now it's the same like with the second wave of pandemic, unspoken gestures, unspoken support. And this is what makes this whole situation such a questionable asset to go in the winter time, right? Because we know that pandemic is not going to stop soon, and economy is not going to increase suddenly during the winter season. How to enter that period of time with so many unsolved issues? This is, I think, the biggest question which we have on our plate right now.
So in the case of Crimea, I think many interpreted the military action as being one way of getting a rallying around the flag effect also for domestic politics within Russia. But if I understand you correctly, you don't sense a similar feeling within the population of Russia towards more of a sort of active or strong measures in protection of the Lukashenko regime in Belarus? Or?
Not at all, not at all. I have to say that even there was a very short moment in the very beginning of the protest, just following a couple of weeks after the elections and electoral fraud, when we could see even the pro-governmental media and pro-governmental telegram channels and spokespersons actually expressing sympathy to the protest. Because I think everyone totally understands that this is a Belarusian issue. This is something what is happening there. It's a country which is in our geopolitical setting just because of the history, because of the Soviet Union, and for many other reasons, which again, half of them are real, half of them are imaginary reasons. But I think that there was never any seriously spoken sentiment that we should go there and take it. Maybe some couple of totally lunatic commentators did something like that, but it definitely wasn't even a hint of consensus on that. And I have to say that if you look back, and still it's possible to find those TV programs in archives of our state TV, in the first weeks, there was this very sympathetic talks about, look, what is happening. People are protesting. There is an electoral fraud, and people have right to protest. Of course, later on it all diminished, but there was this moment, and nobody ever were having any sentiment which was possible to compare with something what happened with Crimea.
Thank you. So earlier today, this morning, we had Sweden's Minister for International Development Cooperation here talking also about the situation in Belarus and talking about ways in which the Swedish government is trying to facilitate a peaceful and democratic transition. So beyond sanctions, I mean, Artyom, but also Elena, what would you suggest would be useful things that the Swedish government and the government representative could do to support such a transition?
I wouldn't say that this question has an easy answer. The leverage is not there. Neither the Swedish government, nor the EU as such, nor the collective West do not have enough leverage in Belarus to meaningfully, change the behavior of the regime and to, tip the balance in favor of the protest, for example. It means that smarter policies probably should be in play. And here I mean working with Russia, but not necessarily on the kind of, Moldova kind of deals where you have a back deal agreeing to depose some kind the leader whom nobody wants, but rather to send some very strong signals to Moscow on what it would mean for Moscow to support Lukashenko, what it would cost for Moscow to support Lukashenko, and what kinds of doors might be opened in case Russia takes a more constructive role. So this stick and carrot kind of approach. It is an open question whether the EU or Sweden or any other Western actor is now ready to enter into such sort of dialogue with Moscow, because it's still perceived as speaking about Belarus over Belarusians' heads, which is not a very good optics, I understand. But if we are pragmatic about this, if you don't have leverage, you have to speak with those who have the leverage. I mean, apart from this, all kinds of humanitarian support to the victims of repression is always the right moral and also a right political step to do, because the future governments of Belarus will remember how and who behaved during the times of the political crisis of today.
So Elena, just as a final comment before we need to break, but do you think the Russian government would listen to such?
I think they can very cautiously, very in very, very diplomatic way, and definitely there should be smart moves. Everything right now in this state where everyone knows that something should happen, but it seems like everyone is a little bit stuck in traditional ways of doing things. So a little bit of imagination, a little bit of actually taking the bold moves without hesitating to listen no as an answer. Because unless you try, you never know. And in that respect, I do think that there is a possibility to find a consensus, because for a change, Russia wants to be a winner in something, not only the permanently blamed party. So maybe there can be an incentive there.
Thank you very much. So it's not entirely easy to put a positive spin to end this panel, but at least let's try and hope that some kind of communication between governments on all different sides can potentially facilitate some kind of peaceful transition towards a state that is good for the people of Belarus in particular. But thank you, Artyom. Thank you, Elena, so much for participating in this panel. And this is the very end of this event altogether. So I also want to take the sort of opportunity and thank all participants who have contributed to what I think was a very interesting and fruitful and informative discussion on many different dimensions of the COVID crisis in Eastern Europe. We also, of course, want to thank you in the audience who have listened in, and I want to apologize for those of you who were with us in the morning for the technical mishaps that happened at that time. But please remember that site is always with you. We organize events like this every now and then. At some point in the future, hopefully not only on Zoom, but also in real life here at the Stockholm School of Economics. So stay in touch. If you have any feedback on today's event, please share it with us. But other than that, make sure to keep an eye on our webpage and our social media posts for any future events that we are organizing. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.